The iron gate groaned open, and the stench struck first, a wall of rot and human misery that clawed at the throat. The turnkey stepped aside, his face wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar, and the prisoner was shoved forward into the blackness. The corridor was narrow, carved from stone older than any living memory, and the walls wept with moisture that might have been rainwater or something worse. Somewhere deeper in the labyrinth, a woman screamed, her voice cracking and then dying away into sobs that no one would answer. The chains on the prisoner's wrists bit into flesh already raw, and the cold of the stone floor rose through thin-soled shoes, promising frostbite before dawn. Above, in the world of coaches and gaslight and theatre crowds, London carried on its business. Down here, in the belly of Newgate, men and women waited in the dark, some for trial, some for the noose, all for the slow grinding of a justice that moved like millstones, crushing bone and hope together. The turnkey lit no candle, the door slammed shut, and in the terrible silence that followed, the only sound was breathing. Dozens of prisoners pressed together in cells meant for half their number, breathing the same foul air, waiting for morning or death, whichever came first. The story of Newgate Prison is not a story of reform or redemption. It is a chronicle of suffering that stretched across 7 centuries, a monument to cruelty built stone by stone, law by law, until it became the most feared name in England. Let us step back now to the beginning and watch as London builds its house of torment. Chapter 1, The Gate of Hell. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world outside has grown distant and small. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour keeps you company, know that you are safe here in this moment, wrapped in darkness, that is kind. But let us drift backward, now, through the centuries, to a darkness of another sort, one built by human hands from stone and iron, where safety was a memory and hope a luxury no coin could purchase. If you find comfort in these chronicles from history's shadow corners, consider subscribing to join us on future journeys into the past. And now, let us begin. The wall was Roman, that much was certain. Built when Britannia was still a province at the edge of empire, when legions marched along the Thames and the settlement called Londinium huddled behind fortifications against the painted tribes beyond. The stones were massive, quarried and hauled and fitted with the precision that Rome demanded of all things, and they had stood for 1,000 years when the Normans came and found them still sound, still strong, still capable of holding back whatever threatened from without. But the Normans saw something else in those ancient walls. They saw that what could keep invaders out could also keep prisoners in. The gate that pierced the western wall had been there since the city's founding, a passage for roads that led to Oxford and the western shires, a place where merchants and pilgrims passed through under the watchful eyes of guards who collected tolls and turned back the suspicious. Newgate it was called, though there was nothing new about it even then. The wooden gates were bound with iron straps, thick as a man's wrist, and the archway above was wide enough for 2 carts to pass abreast. It was a place of coming and going, of hellos and farewells, of the ordinary traffic of a growing city that was beginning to forget its Roman bones. But in the year 1188, during the reign of Henry II, the city fathers made a decision that would echo through 7 centuries. The gate would become a jail. The chambers above the archway, the rooms built into the thickness of the wall itself, would be converted to hold those accused of crimes against the king's peace. London needed a prison closer than the Tower, something the sheriffs could use for common criminals, for debtors and cut purses and those awaiting trial at the assizes. The gate was perfect, strong, central, already guarded. All that was needed was iron bars and heavier locks. The first prisoners were likely surprised by their lodgings. The rooms above the gate had windows that looked out over the street, letting in light and air and the sounds of the city continuing its business below. Compared to the dungeons of the Tower or the pits beneath castle keeps, Newgate might have seemed almost comfortable. But comfort was never the intention. The intention was utility, efficiency, the simple mathematics of keeping bodies contained until the law decided what to do with them. And as the city grew, as London swelled from a modest trading post to a teeming metropolis that would become the largest city in Christendom, the prison grew with it. By the 13th century, the chambers above the gate were no longer sufficient. The keepers began using the gate passage itself at night, chaining prisoners to the walls after the traffic had stopped, letting them lie on the cold stone where 1,000 Roman sandals had once marched. They dug down, excavating cellars beneath the gate, carving out spaces in the earth where light never reached, and the air grew thick with damp. These were the first true dungeons of Newgate, and they set the pattern for everything that would follow. The descent underground, the darkness, the sense that prisoners were being buried alive in the heart of the city. The prison expanded room by room, decade by decade, a cancer growing within the body of the wall. New buildings were erected behind the gate, pressing into the narrow streets, swallowing houses and shops. The keepers lived on site, their families occupying the upper floors while prisoners languished below. It became a small city within the city, with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own brutal customs that had nothing to do with English common law. The keeper was king here, appointed by the city sheriffs, given absolute authority over his domain in exchange for a yearly fee. What happened behind Newgate's doors was his concern and his profit. The profits were considerable. Every prisoner who entered Newgate owed money from the moment the iron door closed behind them. There were fees for admission, fees for removal of irons, fees for a place to sleep that was not directly on the stone floor. There were fees for food beyond the starvation ration provided by the city, fees for candles, fees for the privilege of sending a message to the world outside. A prisoner with money could buy almost anything. A private cell, a fire in winter, wine instead of water, even the company of women who would visit for the right price. A prisoner without money existed in a hell that Dante himself could not have imagined more perfectly. The architecture reflected this economy. The prison divided itself naturally into the master's side and the common side, though there was nothing natural about the division at all. The master's side was for those who could pay, and while it was still a prison, still a place of confinement and misery, it offered thin mattresses and smaller cells and the possibility of privacy. The common side was for everyone else, the poor, the friendless, the ones whose families had nothing to spare or no family at all. The common side was where men and women were pressed together in rooms never meant to hold so many bodies, where the air turned foul within hours and stayed foul, where disease spread like fire through dry timber. Between these two worlds moved the turnkeys, the keeper's assistants who held the keys to every door and lock. They were not called gentlemen. The position attracted those who found satisfaction in the suffering of others, who enjoyed the small godhood of deciding whether a prisoner ate that day or shivered in irons all night or received the beating that might crack a rib or split a lip. The turnkeys took bribes, extorted money from families, sold information about prisoners to anyone who would pay. They were petty tyrants in a kingdom of despair, and they ruled with an iron certainty that no one would hold them accountable. The stone walls grew thick with centuries of grime. Soot from the few candles allowed in the cells, grease from unwashed bodies, mould that flourished in the constant damp. All of it layered onto the ancient Roman masonry until the original colour was forgotten. The walls wept moisture in every season, condensation running down in rivulets that pooled on the floor and soaked through whatever rags the prisoners wore. In winter, that moisture froze, coating the walls with a skin of ice that never fully melted, even when the weak sun of February tried to reach through the barred windows. In summer, the moisture bred things, fungi that grew in corners, insects that laid eggs in the cracks between stones, rats that came up from the sewers and grew fat on whatever they could find. The smell was legendary. Citizens of London who lived near Newgate complained to the city authorities year after year, century after century, about the stench that rolled from the prison like fog. It was the smell of unwashed humanity packed too tightly together, of chamber pots that were emptied once a day if the prisoners were lucky, of bodies rotting from disease and infection, of food gone bad and flesh gone worse. The smell seeped into the surrounding streets, clung to the clothes of anyone who passed too close, warned the nose before the eye could see the dark archway where London's accused disappeared. And disappear they did, by the hundreds, by the thousands, petty thieves who had stolen a loaf of bread, debtors who owed 5 shillings and could not pay, women accused of prostitution, of witchcraft, of speaking too freely or not obeying quickly enough, men who had poached the king's deer, who had spoken against the crown, who had been in the wrong place when violence erupted and blame was being distributed. Children, yes, children, some no older than 7 or 8, accused of pickpocketing or vagrancy, small bodies thrown into cells with hardened criminals, because English law made no provision for the age of prisoners. They came through the gate in chains, prodded by constables or dragged by bailiffs, their names recorded in ledgers that the keeper maintained with careful attention to detail. Not out of justice or compassion, but because the keeper needed to know who owed him money, whose family might be squeezed for fees, whose possessions could be confiscated to offset the cost of their keeping. The ledgers were business records, profit and loss statements from the trade in human misery. The gate itself became a symbol, spoken of with dread in alehouses and workshops across the city. To pass through Newgate was to enter a world where the rules of civilization dissolved, where mercy was a transaction and suffering the common currency. Mothers threatened disobedient children with Newgate. Merchants whispered that competitors had been seen near Newgate, implying debts or crimes. The gate was a mouth that swallowed the unwanted and rarely returned them unchanged, if it returned them at all. The medieval mind understood punishment differently than the modern world would come to understand it. Imprisonment was not the sentence itself, but merely the waiting period before the real sentence was carried out. Men and women were not sent to Newgate to serve time, to be reformed or rehabilitated. They were sent there to await trial, and after trial to await whatever the court had ordered, hanging, most commonly, or branding, or the pillory, or transportation to distant colonies. The prison was a holding pen, nothing more, and the conditions reflected that cold utilitarianism, that people lived there, sometimes for years. Trials were slow, courts met irregularly, evidence was difficult to gather in an age when witnesses might be scattered across the country, and travel took weeks. A man accused of murder might wait in Newgate for a year or more before his case was heard, existing in a limbo where he was neither convicted nor free, neither living nor quite dead. Some died before trial, their bodies carried out and buried in unmarked graves in the prison yard, their names crossed off the keeper's ledger with a note about who would pay for the winding sheet. The gate stood year after year, while dynasties rose and fell beyond its walls. Plantagenet kings gave way to Tudors, Tudors to Stuarts, Stuarts to the Commonwealth, and then back to Stuart again. And through it all, Newgate remained constant, unchanging, a fixture of London life as permanent as the Thames itself. Fire swept through the city in 1606, consuming everything from the Tower to Temple Bar, and Newgate burned with it. But London rebuilt the prison even before rebuilding the cathedral, because a city needed a place to put its criminals, and Newgate had always served that purpose well enough. The new prison was larger, grander in a grim way, built of Portland stone instead of Roman rubble. The architects incorporated the latest thinking on prison design, which meant very little thinking at all. Cells were still dark, still damp, still overcrowded. The keeper still collected his fees, the turnkeys still ruled with violence, the prisoners still suffered and died in numbers that the city authorities found acceptable. The gate had a new face, classical columns and a forbidding facade, but behind the stone nothing had changed. The descent continued down into the oldest parts of the prison, down into the darkness that had been there since the beginning. Chapter 2. The Common Side. The stairway descended 15 steps from the keeper's lodge to the yard, and then another 15 steps down to the first level of the common side. The stairs were worn smooth by thousands of feet, hollowed in the centre where generations of prisoners had shuffled in their chains, and the walls on either side were scratched with names, dates, prayers, curses, pleas to God or the devil, or anyone who might listen. The turnkey moved quickly, his lantern casting wild shadows, and the prisoner behind him moved slowly, carefully, because the chains on his ankles allowed only the smallest steps, and a fall here would mean broken bones at the bottom. The door at the base of the stairs was oak, iron-banded, with a slot at eye level that could be opened from outside but not within. The turnkey worked his key in the lock, a massive mechanism that required both hands to turn, and the door swung inward with a groan that spoke of rust and age and hinges that had not been oiled in living memory. The smell hit like a physical blow. The prisoner gasped, turned his head, tried to breathe through his mouth instead of his nose, but there was no escaping it. The turnkey laughed, shoved him forward, and slammed the door shut. Cue common side. Received no natural light. There were no windows here, no openings to the world above, except for a grate in the ceiling that led to the exercise yard, and that grate was covered with iron bars spaced so closely that even a child's hand could not slip between them. What light existed came from a single tallow candle that burned in a sconce by the door, replaced once a day when the turnkey brought the bread ration, and from whatever candles the prisoners themselves could afford to buy. Most could afford nothing, and so the common side existed in a permanent twilight, a gloom so thick that shapes became indistinct, and faces were known by voice rather than sight. The room was 30 feet long and perhaps 15 wide, with a ceiling so low that a tall man could not stand fully upright. The walls were the same Roman stone that formed the foundation of the prison, slick with moisture and filmed with something that might have been mould or might have been worse. The floor was flagstone, uneven, with gaps between the stones where things accumulated. Water, waste, scraps of rotted food, the detritus of human existence at its most basic and desperate. There were no beds, no benches, no furniture of any kind. The prisoners slept on the floor, on whatever they had brought with them or could scavenge, and they slept pressed together because there was no room to lie apart. On the night the new prisoner arrived, there were 47 people in that room. The common side was meant, according to the keeper's records, to hold 20. But capacity was a flexible concept in Newgate, measured not by humanity or comfort, but by the simple question of whether another body could physically fit through the door. 47 was not the record. The turnkeys spoke casually of nights when 60 or more had been crammed into the common side, packed so tightly that no one could sit, much less lie down, and the night passed with everyone standing or crouching, swaying on their feet, trying not to collapse onto the person beside them. The prisoners learned to sleep in shifts. Some would lie down for a few hours, while others stood guard, protecting their small territory of floor space from those who might try to expand their own. Then they would trade places, the sleepers rising and the watchers lying down, a constant rotation that continued through the night. Fights broke out over floor space, over whose turn it was to sleep, over perceived slights and actual theft, and the simple accumulated rage of people who had nothing left to lose. The turnkeys rarely intervened. Let them fight, the thinking went. Let them kill each other if they wanted. Fewer mouths to feed meant more profit for the keeper. The bread came once a day, delivered through the slot in the door around noon. The City of London provided a standard ration for prisoners, a loaf of coarse brown bread weighing approximately 1 pound, baked from flour that was often mouldy, sometimes mixed with sawdust or chalk to stretch the supply. 1 pound of bread per prisoner per day, and nothing else unless the prisoner had money to buy food from the keeper's kitchen. 1 pound of bread was not enough to sustain a grown man, not even close, but it was enough to keep him alive for weeks or months while the law ground slowly toward whatever verdict awaited him. The distribution of the bread was a daily crisis. The turnkey would open the slot, shove the loaves through in a heap, and slam the slot shut again before anyone could try to reach through and grab him. Then the prisoners fought over the pile. The strong took more than their share, the weak went hungry, and those who were sick or injured or simply too exhausted to fight might get nothing at all. A hierarchy established itself quickly in every cell, based on size, violence, and the willingness to hurt others to survive. At the top were the men who had been in Newgate before, who knew how the system worked, who had connections outside that might bring them money or help, or at least the reputation of being dangerous enough to leave alone. At the bottom were the newcomers, the frightened, the old, the young, the women. Yes, women were housed in the common side as well, though officially they were supposed to be kept separate from the men. The prison had a women's ward, but it was even smaller than the men's quarters, and when it filled, which it always did, the overflow was simply dumped into the common side with no protection and no recourse. What happened to those women was predictable and horrible and entirely preventable, and the keeper prevented nothing. The turnkeys would later claim they heard no screams, saw no violence, had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. The women who survived learned to attach themselves to the strongest man they could find, offering whatever they had in exchange for protection. Those who could not or would not make such bargains suffered in ways that the darkness mercifully hid from history's full accounting. Water came from a single pump in the yard above, and prisoners were allowed up once a day to fill whatever containers they had. A lucky few possessed tin cups or small jugs. Most cupped their hands and drank what they could, then splashed water on their faces and hair, trying to clean themselves with the few seconds they were given before the turnkeys herded them back downstairs. The water itself was suspect, drawn from a well that was too close to the prison cesspit. But there was no choice. Drink the foul water or die of thirst, and death by thirst was slower and more agonizing than whatever sickness the water might bring. The cesspit was in a corner of the cell, nothing more than a large bucket that was emptied once a day by prisoners selected for the task, usually the newest arrivals, who had not yet earned enough status to refuse. The bucket was never quite empty, never quite clean, and the smell of it permeated everything. Clothes reeked of it, skin absorbed it, hair became matted with the particles that floated in the air. Prisoners stopped noticing after a while, their noses adjusting to the constant assault, but visitors to the common side would retch and gag, pressing handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or lavender water over their faces, backing away from the door as quickly as they had approached. Disease flourished in these conditions with an enthusiasm that seemed almost purposeful, as if the prison itself were a living thing that fed on suffering. Typhus was the great killer, spread by the lice that infested every prisoner within days of arrival. The lice bred in clothing and hair and the seams and folds of fabric, and they bit constantly, leaving red welts that itched until they bled and then became infected. Typhus began with fever and headache, progressed to delirium and a characteristic rash, and ended in death for about 1 in 4 who contracted it. The prisoners called it jail fever, and they were not wrong to associate it specifically with imprisonment. The combination of overcrowding, filth and lice created perfect conditions for the disease to spread, and it spread with such regularity that the court judges who tried cases at Newgate Sessions often caught it themselves and died, leading to the practice of carrying nosegays of herbs into the courtroom and sprinkling the dock with vinegar before the prisoners were brought up. Dysentery was almost as common, caused by the contaminated water and the utter absence of sanitation. It killed more slowly than typhus, but just as certainly, leaving its victims weak and dehydrated, unable to keep down even the meagre bread ration, wasting away in pools of their own discharge. There was no treatment, no medicine, no physician who would enter the common side to examine a sick prisoner. They died in the dark, on the stone floor, surrounded by people who could do nothing to help, and who moved away as far as the space allowed, knowing that whatever sickness had taken their cellmate might take them next. Tuberculosis was a slower death, but perhaps the most common. The perpetual damp, the poor nutrition, the foul air that was breathed and rebreathed by dozens of people in a sealed space, all of it conspired to weaken lungs and invite infection. The cough began softly, a small irritation in the throat, and progressed over months or years to the characteristic deep, wet hackings that brought up blood and pieces of tissue. Prisoners with tuberculosis were not separated from the healthy, because there was nowhere to separate them to, and so the disease passed from person to person, a gift that kept giving long after the original sufferer had died and been carried out and dumped in the burial pit. The children were the hardest to witness. English law in the 18th century made no distinction between adult and child criminals, and children as young as 7 were imprisoned in Newgate for offences, that would barely register today, stealing a handkerchief, taking an apple from a cart, being found on the street after dark without a master. They were thrown into the common side with everyone else, small bodies lost in the mass of adult prisoners, and what happened to them there was predictable and unrecorded and entirely preventable. Some were protected by older prisoners who felt a residual human decency, who shared their bread and kept the worst predators away. Others were not so lucky. The children who survived Newgate rarely remained children afterward, not in any sense that mattered. Time in the common side moved strangely, unmoored from the normal progression of day and night, without windows or clocks, without any regular schedule beyond the arrival of bread at noon. Hours blended together into an undifferentiated block of darkness and waiting. Prisoners slept when exhaustion overtook them, woke when noise or pain or hunger made sleep impossible, and existed in between in a state that was neither waking nor sleeping, but something suspended between the two. Some went mad from it, the isolation within the crowd, the darkness without end. They would begin talking to people who were not there, arguing with voices only they could hear, laughing at jokes that existed only in minds that had finally broken under the strain. The keeper cared nothing for madness or sanity, health or sickness, justice or innocence. He cared only for the fees he collected and the profit he extracted from misery. A prisoner who went mad was still a prisoner, still counted in the ledger, still owed money for his keeping. If he died, there were fees for the burial. If he recovered, there were fees for the physician, though no physician ever came, and the fees were simply added to the bill. The system was perfect in its way, circular and self-sustaining, feeding on itself like a snake swallowing its tail, and it had been perfecting itself for 500 years by the time the 18th century dawned, and reformers began to notice that something might be wrong. But reform was distant, theoretical, a conversation happening in coffee houses and drawing rooms far from the stone walls and iron doors of the common side. Inside those walls, in that darkness, life continued as it always had, brutal, short, and cheap. The prisoners clung to whatever scraps of humanity they could maintain, sharing stories of their lives before Newgate, of families and homes and work and freedom, speaking these memories aloud as if to prove to themselves that such things had once been real. Some formed friendships, alliances that transcended the hierarchy of violence and helped both parties survive a little longer. Some found God in the darkness, or found him again after years of absence, and prayer became their anchor against the tide of despair. Others found nothing, or found only anger, or found a cold determination to survive at any cost and to extract revenge on the world that had put them here when they finally got out, if they got out, the common side was a crucible, burning away everything soft and unnecessary, leaving only what was hard and essential and capable of enduring the unendurable. It was where London sent its poor, its broken, its accused, and it transformed them into something else entirely, something that would carry the mark of Newgate for whatever days remained to them, whether those days were lived in freedom or ended on the gallows. Chapter 3. The Master's Side. The key that opened the door to the Master's Side was smaller than the one that locked the common side, brass instead of iron, and it turned in its lock with a smooth click that spoke of better maintenance and lighter use. The door itself was newer, the wood still showing its grain beneath layers of varnish, and the corridor beyond was lit not by a single guttering candle, but by a series of oil lamps in sconces along the wall. The light was still dim, still tinged with the yellow-orange glow of burning oil, but it was enough to see by, enough to distinguish faces and read expressions and navigate without shuffling like a blind man feeling his way through the dark. The Master's Side was for those who could pay, and the difference between this wing and the common side was measured not merely in coin, but in the preservation of what small dignities could survive imprisonment. Here there were separate cells, small rooms that could house 2 or 3 prisoners rather than 40, with doors that could be closed for privacy and windows, actual windows, albeit barred and narrow, that admitted daylight and fresh air. The cells had furniture, rough benches and tables that were nevertheless furniture, and some even had beds, straw mattresses on wooden frames raised off the stone floor. A prisoner on the master's side could sleep lying down, in a space that was his own, without the press of other bodies and the fear that someone might rob or assault him while he slept. But this luxury came at a price, and the price was not fixed. The keeper of Newgate operated the master's side like a tavern or boarding house, with a sliding scale of fees that depended on how much money the prisoner had and how desperately he wanted to avoid the common side. The initial garnish, the entry fee, could be anywhere from 10 shillings to several pounds, depending on the keeper's assessment of the prisoner's means. Then there were weekly fees for the cell, additional fees for bedding, fees for the removal of irons, fees for candles, fees for the privilege of having the cell cleaned, or receiving visitors without a turnkey present. The fees accumulated week after week, and a prisoner who entered the master's side with a modest fortune could find himself penniless within a month, at which point he would be transferred to the common side to make room for someone who could still pay. The economy of Newgate was elaborate and entirely without regulation. The keeper was appointed by the city sheriffs and paid them a yearly rent for the privilege of running the prison, typically several £100s. In exchange, he was given free rein to extract whatever profit he could from the prisoners in his care. This system ensured that the city did not have to pay for the operation of the prison. It actually made money from it, while the keeper was incentivized to maximize the number of prisoners and the fees they paid. It was a business arrangement, pure and simple, with human suffering as the commodity being traded. The keeper lived well. His apartment occupied the upper floors of the prison, rooms with real windows that overlooked the street rather than the yard, furnished with items that would not have looked out of place in a merchant's house. Upholstered chairs, a dining table, paintings on the walls. His family lived with him, children who played in rooms directly above where prisoners languished in chains, wives who entertained visitors in parlours, while screams echoed up from below. The keepers of Newgate were not ashamed of their profession. They saw themselves as providing a service, managing a difficult population, maintaining order where chaos threatened. That they grew wealthy doing so was simply the reward for taking on such unpleasant work. The most infamous keeper of the 18th century was a man named William Acton, who held the position from 1792 to 1803 and perfected the art of extraction. Acton understood that fear was the most profitable emotion, and he cultivated it carefully. A new prisoner arriving at Newgate would be shown both the master's side and the common side, given a tour of the comparative luxury and the absolute horror, and then asked which he preferred. The implication was clear: pay or suffer. Most paid, draining their savings and begging money from family, selling property at a loss to raise cash, doing anything to avoid being cast into the darkness below. Acton also ran what amounted to a shop inside the prison, selling food, drink, and other necessaries at inflated prices. Prisoners on the master's side could purchase actual meals rather than surviving on bread and water, mutton stews, pies, cheese, ale, even wine for those who could afford it. The food was prepared in the keeper's kitchen and carried down by servants, served on pewter plates that had to be returned immediately lest they be fashioned into weapons or tools for escape. A prisoner with money could live relatively comfortably in Newgate, eating well and sleeping in a real bed, seeing visitors in a private room, even sending letters out without having them read by the turnkeys first. But money ran out, and when it did, the transformation was swift and merciless. A prisoner who could no longer pay his fees would find himself removed from his cell in the master's side, his possessions confiscated to offset the debt, and marched down the stairs to the common side. There was no appeal, no negotiation, no possibility of maintaining one's position through promises or future payment. The keeper had heard every plea and excuse, and he had learned long ago that sympathy was unprofitable. The prisoner would be pushed through the door into the darkness, and the door would slam shut, and within hours he would understand exactly how much he had lost when his money ran out. Some prisoners managed to avoid this fate by maintaining connections to the outside world. Family members would send money regularly. Friends would visit with coins hidden in the folds of clothing. Solicitors would arrange for funds to be delivered to the keeper on a schedule. These prisoners could survive in the master's side for years if their trial was delayed, or if they were awaiting transportation rather than execution. They formed a strange community, these long-term residents of the better cells, developing routines and hierarchies, and even a kind of social life that mimicked the world beyond the walls. They played cards using decks that were worn soft as cloth from constant shuffling. They gambled, betting on anything: the outcome of trials, the weather, how many would be hanged at the next execution day. They told stories, recounting their crimes with embellishment and pride, turning theft and violence into adventures worthy of ballads. Some wrote letters, long rambling epistles to family or friends or lovers, describing life in Newgate with a frankness that would have been impossible in any other circumstance. These letters survive in archives now, brittle with age, and they provide a window into a world that was both utterly foreign and disturbingly familiar. The women's section of the master's side was smaller and even more expensive than the men's, reflecting both the smaller number of women imprisoned and the keeper's understanding that desperate families would pay even more to keep daughters and wives out of the common side. The women's cells were marginally cleaner, marginally safer, though safety was always relative in Newgate. Female prisoners with money could hire other women to serve as companions and protectors, essentially buying bodyguards to ward off the attention of turnkeys and male prisoners who might have access to their corridor. Those without money made different arrangements, offering services or simply enduring whatever came, knowing that complaint was useless and resistance dangerous. The turnkeys on the master's side were slightly more professional than their counterparts below, if only because the prisoners they guarded had the means to complain, and the connections to make those complaints heard. But professional did not mean kind or honest. The turnkeys still accepted bribes, still sold information, still looked the other way when violence occurred, or when prisoners arranged for items that were officially forbidden: weapons, tools, even opium for those who could afford to spend their remaining days in a haze. The turnkeys were partners in the economy of suffering, taking their cut of every transaction, ensuring that money flowed upward to the keeper, while just enough trickled down to keep them loyal. Visitors to the master's side were common, especially on Sundays when the prison opened its doors to family members and curiosity seekers alike. For a small fee, anyone could enter Newgate and wander the corridors of the master's side, gawking at the prisoners as if they were animals in a menagerie. Some visitors came out of genuine concern, bringing food or clean clothing or news from outside. Others came for entertainment, to see the famous criminals whose cases had been reported in the newspapers, to hear them speak and judge for themselves whether they were guilty or wronged. The prisoners learned to perform for these audiences, telling dramatic versions of their stories, proclaiming innocence or boasting of cleverness, depending on what seemed likely to generate sympathy or admiration, or perhaps a coin or two. The practice of allowing public access to the prison was unique to England and reflected a cultural attitude toward crime and punishment that was both more open and more cruel than the systems developing in other countries. The theory was that visibility would serve as deterrence, let people see where criminals ended up, and they would think twice before breaking the law themselves. In practice, the public tours turned Newgate into a theatre, with prisoners as the actors and the whole grim business of incarceration as the show. The keeper charged admission and made a tidy profit from these tours, adding yet another stream of revenue to his already considerable income. Among the more unusual features of the master's side were the tap rooms, small rooms where prisoners could purchase and consume alcohol under the watchful eye of a turnkey. Newgate had several of these tap rooms scattered throughout the better sections, and they functioned much like the public houses outside the walls, places where men gathered to drink and talk and forget, temporarily, where they were. The alcohol was expensive, the atmosphere was grim, but the escape it offered was real enough. at least until the drink wore off and reality reasserted itself in the form of stone walls and iron bars and the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same as today and the day after that until trial or death provided release. The most privileged prisoners on the master's side were those with connections to power, gentlemen accused of fraud, military officers awaiting courts martial, even occasionally members of the aristocracy, whose debts or scandals had landed them in Newgate. These prisoners received special treatment, not out of mercy, but out of recognition that they might regain their positions and their influence, and a keeper who had treated them well could expect favours in return. They were given the best cells, the most privacy, the least harassment from turnkeys. Some were allowed to wear their own clothes rather than prison garb to receive visitors without restriction, even to leave the prison during the day under escort, returning each evening like students at a very peculiar boarding school. But even for these privileged few, Newgate was still Newgate. The walls still pressed close, the air still carried the smell of the prison, the knowledge of what lay below in the common side still haunted every moment. A gentleman in a good cell with clean sheets and regular meals was still a prisoner, still subject to the keeper's whims, still waiting for a trial that might end with transportation or the noose. The comfort of the master's side was relative, a matter of degrees rather than kind, and everyone who lived there understood that they were still trapped in the same machine of justice, still being ground between the same stones, just at a slightly slower speed. The isolation was sometimes worse on the master's side than below, despite the better conditions. In the common side, prisoners were forced together by necessity, and that forced proximity created bonds, however temporary or self-serving. On the master's side, prisoners could afford to keep to themselves, to maintain distance, to pretend that they were still the respectable people they had been before their arrest. But this pretense required constant effort and ultimately failed, because the truth was impossible to ignore. They were prisoners, confined and judged, and waiting for a verdict that might strip away everything they had ever been. The loneliness of maintaining dignity in such circumstances was its own form of torture, quieter than the violence of the common side, but no less corrosive to the spirit. Chapter 4. The Condemned Hold. The condemned hold lay beneath the prison chapel, a location chosen with what might have been cruelty, or might have been simple architectural convenience. The distinction hardly mattered to those who were brought there. The descent began at the east end of the chapel floor, where a trapdoor opened onto a narrow staircase that wound down into darkness. 15 steps again, the same number that led to the common side, as if Newgate had been designed according to some mathematical principle of suffering that demanded consistency in the architecture of descent. The walls were closer here, pressing in from both sides, and the ceiling lowered with each step until even a man of average height had to duck his head to avoid the stone above. The hold itself was a single chamber, perhaps 20 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to a point in the centre like an upside-down ship's hull. The vault was medieval, older than the rest of the prison, part of the original gate structure that had stood since Norman times. The stones were massive, fitted together without mortar in the ancient style, and they had acquired over the centuries a peculiar quality of seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. A candle held in the condemned hold cast less illumination than the same candle would cast anywhere else, as if the darkness here were thicker, more substantial, a thing with weight and presence. There were no windows. The hold lay entirely below ground level beneath even the foundations of the newer prison buildings, and the only ventilation came from a single shaft that rose up through the chapel floor above. The shaft was narrow, perhaps 6 inches in diameter, cut through the stone in a straight vertical line, and it served 2 purposes. It allowed a minimal circulation of air, preventing the prisoners below from suffocating entirely, and it allowed sound to travel upward, so that during Sunday services the condemned could hear the prayers being said above their heads, the hymns being sung, the sermon being delivered by the prison chaplain about the mercy of God and the salvation available to even the worst sinners. The condemned could hear all of this, every word and note, and they could smell the incense that the chaplain burned during services, the sweet smoke drifting down through the shaft along with the singing. But they could see nothing, and they could not call out, because the turnkeys had learned long ago that prisoners in the condemned hold would sometimes scream during services, disrupting the worship and disturbing the fine ladies and gentlemen who attended chapel at Newgate as a form of fashionable piety. A prisoner who screamed would be gagged, a leather strap buckled around his head, and left that way until the service ended. The prisoners in the condemned hold were those who had been tried and sentenced to death. They had stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, heard the evidence against them, listened to the judge pronounce the words that ended with "hanged by the neck until you are dead," and been taken directly from the courtroom to this chamber beneath the chapel. They were kept here for the days or weeks between sentencing and execution, a period that varied depending on the schedule of hanging days and the number of condemned waiting their turn. Newgate executed in batches, groups of 10 or 12 or sometimes 20 prisoners all hanged on the same morning, and the condemned hold filled and emptied according to this terrible rhythm. The chamber held no furniture except for a long wooden bench against one wall and a bucket in the corner that served the same purpose as in every other part of the prison. The prisoners slept on the floor, on the bare stone. Though sleep was a generous term for what happened in the condemned hold, they lay in the darkness listening to the sounds from above, footsteps in the chapel during the day, the creaking of the building at night, and worst of all the hammering from the yard where the carpenters built the coffins. Each condemned prisoner would require a coffin, and the prison purchased them cheaply from a workshop that had a standing contract. Rough pine boxes assembled quickly and without care, designed only to hold a body long enough to transport it from the gallows to the burial. Ground. The hammering usually began 3 days before an execution. The sound echoed through the stone walls, a steady rhythm of nails being driven into wood, and the prisoners below counted each blow, performing their own arithmetic of death. 10 coffins meant 10 would hang. 15 coffins meant 15. The carpenters worked without pause, building their boxes in stacks, and when they finished they stored them in the yard just outside the door to the condemned hold, so that the prisoners could hear them being moved, could hear the wooden boxes scraping against stone as they were arranged in neat rows, waiting. The prison chaplain visited the condemned hold daily, descending the stairs with a lantern and a Bible, to offer spiritual counsel and to extract confessions. The chaplain was a curious figure in the economy of Newgate, simultaneously a minister of God and an entrepreneur in the marketplace of last words. His official duty was to prepare the condemned for death, to help them make peace with their sins and accept their fate with Christian resignation. His unofficial duty, the one that made his position lucrative, was to record their confessions and sell them as broadsheets immediately after the execution. These confessions were enormously popular with the reading public. The Ordinary's account, as it was called, the Ordinary being the chaplain's formal title, was published after every major execution and sold in the thousands, satisfying the public appetite for crime stories and moral lessons. The condemned knew this, understood that their final words would become entertainment, and some used the opportunity to craft their legacy. They would dictate elaborate confessions to the chaplain, admitting to crimes they had committed, and sometimes to crimes they had not, embellishing their life stories with details that would make good reading. Others refused to confess at all, maintaining their innocence to the end, and these refusals were also recorded and published, presented as either evidence of remarkable stubbornness or of genuine wrongful conviction depending on the chaplain's editorial choices. The chaplain kept careful notes during these interviews, writing by lantern light on pages that he would later transcribe and expand. He asked questions designed to elicit dramatic responses. Did you feel remorse when you struck the blow? What were your final thoughts before you were apprehended? Do you believe God can forgive such wickedness? And he shaped the answers to fit conventional moral narratives. The murderer must express remorse. The thief must blame bad companions. The forger must acknowledge the sin of greed. The formula was well established, and the chaplain guided each prisoner toward the expected confession, promising that a good account would be read sympathetically by the public and might provide some comfort to their families after they were gone. Some prisoners refused to cooperate. They told the chaplain to leave them alone to take his Bible and his promises of salvation and return to the comfortable rooms above where he lived, well on the profits of their deaths. These refusals created problems for the Ordinary's account, because a prisoner who would not confess was less interesting to readers, but the chaplain learned to work around the problem by speculating about their inner thoughts, by describing their appearance and manner in the condemned hold, by suggesting that their silence itself was evidence of the hardness of their hearts. One way or another, every condemned prisoner became material for the next edition. The nights in the condemned hold were the longest. During the day there was the chaplain's visit to break the monotony, and the sounds from above suggested that the world continued despite their absence from it. But at night the prison grew quiet, the footsteps ceased. Even the rats that infested every other part of Newgate seemed to avoid the condemned hold, as if they could sense the approach of death and wanted no part of it. The prisoners lay in darkness so complete that they could not see their own hands in front of their faces, and they waited, and they thought about morning. The morning of execution began early, hours before dawn. The turnkeys would descend to the condemned hold carrying lanterns and irons, because the condemned were brought out in chains even though there was nowhere for them to run. The irons used for execution were lighter than the standard prison chains, designed to allow the prisoner to walk and to climb the steps to the scaffold, but still substantial enough to mark them as condemned. The prisoners were given clean shirts, white linen provided by the prison at no charge, the only thing Newgate gave freely because it was important for the condemned to look presentable at the gallows. They were led up the stairs in single file, blinking in the sudden light even though it was still dark outside, and brought into the chapel for the final service. The condemned service was brief, a few prayers and a short sermon about judgment and mercy, and the prisoners stood in the centre aisle surrounded by empty pews while the chaplain read from his notes. Then they were taken out to the yard where the carts waited, open wagons with low sides, and they were helped or pushed onto the rough wooden floors. The coffins were already loaded, stacked at the back of each cart, and the condemned could see them there, could count them, could understand with a clarity that erased all remaining hope that this was not a dream or a mistake or something that might still be prevented. The carts rolled out through the prison gate at 8 in the morning, part of a procession that had become one of London's most reliable public spectacles. The condemned sat or stood in the carts, depending on their strength and their willingness to cooperate, and they were accompanied by the chaplain reading prayers, by turnkeys to prevent escape, and by the hangman and his assistants who rode along to ensure that everything proceeded smoothly when they reached Tyburn. The distance from Newgate to the Tyburn gallows was approximately 3 miles, and the journey took 2 hours or more depending on the crowds. But before the carts could leave, before the condemned could begin that final journey, they spent their last night in the hold beneath the chapel, and those nights were unlike any other experience of time that human beings normally endure. The condemned were neither alive nor dead, but suspended between states, still breathing and thinking and feeling, but already mourned by families who had said their final goodbyes during visiting hours, already forgotten by a legal system that had processed them and sentenced them and moved on to the next batch of accused. They existed in a liminal space that the architecture of Newgate had made physical, a room beneath the ground where prayers from above drifted down like snow but brought no warmth, where the smell of incense mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear sweat, where the only certain thing was that morning would come and the carts would roll. Some prisoners spent their last night praying, others cursed, venting rage at the witnesses who had testified against them, at the judges who had sentenced them, at God for allowing such injustice. Some wept, tears running down faces they could not see in the darkness, mourning not so much their own deaths as the lives they would not live, the children that they would not watch grow, the simple pleasures they would never experience again, the taste of bread that was not stale, the feeling of rain on skin, the sound of laughter. Some retreated into silence, withdrawing so completely that they seemed already dead, their bodies present but their minds gone somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of the condemned hold and its terrible weight of certainty. A few tried to maintain courage, speaking loudly about how they would die well, how they would show no fear on the scaffold, how the crowd would remember their names and speak of them with admiration. These boasts rang hollow in the darkness, the bravado of men trying to convince themselves as much as their cellmates, but they served a purpose. They filled the silence. They provided something to focus on besides the hammering of hearts and the counting of hours. They asserted that even in the condemned hold a man could choose how he faced what was coming. The children who were brought to the condemned hold, and there were children, boys of 12 or 13 sentenced to hang for theft or housebreaking, often broke completely. They cried for their mothers, begged the turnkeys for mercy that would not come, clung to the older prisoners who sometimes offered comfort and sometimes pushed them away, unable to bear the additional burden of another's terror when their own was barely manageable. The chaplain tried to provide solace, speaking of heaven and innocence and the special mercy God reserved for the young, but his words meant nothing in that darkness, in that knowledge of mourning and carts and rope. The worst moment was the silence just before the turnkeys arrived. The prisoners in the condemned hold could hear the prison waking above them, could hear the changing of the watch and the delivery of bread to the other cells, and the general stirring that marked the beginning of a new day. They could hear all of this, and they knew that the turnkeys would be coming soon, and the waiting became almost unbearable, each second stretching out until time seemed to stop altogether. Then the sound of boots on the stairs, the rattle of keys, the scrape of the door opening, and lantern light flooding into the hold like water into a drowning man's lungs. The condemned hold emptied regularly, cleared out after each execution day, scrubbed clean by prisoners assigned to the task, and then gradually filled again as new trials concluded and new sentences were passed and new bodies were brought down those 15 steps into the darkness. The cycle repeated without variation, week after week, month after month, year after year, and the stones absorbed it all, the prayers and the curses, the weeping and the silence, the confessions and the defiance. The stones remembered nothing and revealed nothing, and they would stand long after every prisoner who had ever been held there had turned to dust in unmarked graves. Chapter 5. The Stone Jug. The prisoners had their own language for Newgate, a vocabulary of slang that reduced the horror to something almost manageable through the alchemy of naming. The stone jug, they called it, a term that came from the rhyming slang of the London underworld where jug meant prison and stone was simply descriptive. To be jugged was to be imprisoned, and to be in the stone jug was to be in Newgate specifically, and every petty criminal and cut-person housebreaker in London knew the phrase and feared it. There were other names too, the Wit, short for Whittington, after a charitable bequest that provided a small amount of bread to prisoners centuries before, but Stone Jug was the name that stuck. The name that captured something essential about the place, the cold, immovable permanence of it, the sense that entering Newgate was like being sealed in a vessel from which there was no pouring out. Life inside the Stone Jug developed its own rhythms and customs that had nothing to do with the official regulations posted on the keeper's wall. The prisoners created their own social structures, their own hierarchies and laws, their own methods of survival that operated in parallel to and often in direct contradiction of the formal system of justice that had put them there. These prison cultures varied between the different sections of Newgate. The commons side had one set of rules, the masters' side another, the women's quarters a third, but they all shared certain features, certain patterns of behaviour that emerged whenever people were confined together under desperate circumstances with no prospect of immediate release. The most important currency in Newgate was not money, though money mattered enormously, but information. A prisoner who knew which turnkeys could be bribed, which fellow inmates could be trusted, which crimes were currently being investigated by which magistrates, which judges were harsh, and which might show mercy. This prisoner had something valuable that could be traded for food, protection, or simply a less miserable existence. Information flowed through the prison along invisible channels, passed from cell to cell through whispered conversations during exercise periods, through messages scratched on tin plates, through the network of prisoners who worked as trustees and had access to different parts of the building. The trustees were prisoners who had been given special privileges in exchange for performing tasks that the turnkeys considered beneath them. They delivered food, emptied chamber pots, cleaned cells, carried messages between sections of the prison, and in the process they saw and heard everything. A clever trustee could parlay this access into considerable power within the prison hierarchy, becoming an information broker who sold what he knew to whoever could pay. The turnkeys tolerated this because it made their jobs easier, and because many of them received a cut of whatever the trustees earned. The keeper tolerated it because it maintained order. Prisoners who were busy trading and scheming were prisoners who were not rioting or attempting escape. Escape was discussed constantly, but attempted rarely, because the architecture of Newgate made it nearly impossible. The walls were stone, the doors were iron, the windows were barred with metal thick as a man's thumb, and the entire structure was surrounded by the city itself, meaning that even if a prisoner somehow got out of his cell and out of the building, he would still be standing in the middle of London with nowhere to hide. Yet prisoners still dreamed of escape, still examined every window and door for weaknesses, still hoarded stolen nails and broken spoon handles and anything else that might be fashioned into a tool. The most famous escape attempt occurred in 1714 when a highwayman named Jack Sheppard broke out of Newgate not once but twice, the second time from the condemned hold itself just days before his scheduled execution. Sheppard was a celebrity criminal beloved by the London public for his boldness and his repeated escapes from custody, and his final breakout from Newgate became the stuff of legend. He removed his manacles using a nail, broke through 6 locked doors using a crude iron bar, climbed up a chimney, crossed the prison roof, descended to the street using knotted bedsheets, and disappeared into the London night. He was recaptured 2 weeks later, drunk in a tavern, and this time the authorities took no chances. They chained him to the floor of the condemned hold with irons weighing 300 pounds and posted guards outside his door day and night until they could get him to the gallows. Sheppard's escape inspired generations of prisoners who came after him, but it also inspired the keepers to improve security. The chimneys were fitted with iron grills, the doors were reinforced, the roof was topped with iron spikes, and the exercise yard was built with walls too high and too smooth to climb. By the late 18th century, escape from Newgate required either extensive outside help or extraordinary luck, and most prisoners focused instead on the more realistic goal of improving their conditions within the walls. The social hierarchies that formed in each section of the prison were brutal and entirely predictable. At the top were the violent criminals, the murderers, and the professional thieves who had been through the system before and knew how to navigate it. These men took the best sleeping spares, received the largest portions of food, and ruled through intimidation and occasional demonstration of force. Below them were the ordinary criminals, the pickpockets and burglars and forgers who made up the bulk of Newgate's population. They occupied the middle ranks, neither powerful enough to challenge the top tier, nor weak enough to be pushed to the bottom. At the bottom were the debtors, the first-time offenders, the old and the sick, and anyone who showed weakness or fear. These prisoners received whatever was left after everyone else had taken their share, slept in the worst spots, and were subject to constant harassment and theft. A prisoner at the bottom of the hierarchy might have his shoes stolen on his first night, his coat taken the second night, his food stolen every day until he learned to eat quickly, or find protection from someone higher up. The only way to rise in this hierarchy was through violence or the acquisition of money, and most prisoners had access to neither. Women in Newgate faced additional challenges beyond those faced by male prisoners. The women's sections were smaller and generally less violent than the men's sections, but they were also more isolated, with fewer visitors and less access to the informal support networks that sustained many male prisoners. Women were imprisoned for different crimes than men: prostitution, infanticide, theft of clothing or food, occasionally poisoning, and they were judged more harshly by society, and often by the courts as well. A woman who had killed her husband might expect no mercy, while a man who had killed his wife might receive a lesser sentence on the grounds of provocation. The women formed their own hierarchies, based partly on the reasons for their imprisonment, and partly on the same factors that govern male hierarchies: strength, resourcefulness, and the ability to acquire money or protection. The women's section had its own economy, parallel to but separate from it. The men's, with goods and services traded through a network of relationships that the turnkeys barely understood and rarely tried to control. Some women worked as laundresses, washing clothes for prisoners who could afford to pay, and they used this access to move between different parts of the prison carrying messages and contraband. Others sold themselves, continuing the work that had put many of them in Newgate in the first place, servicing male prisoners and occasionally turnkeys in exchange for money or favours. The prison chaplain conducted services every Sunday into the chapel above the condemned hold, and attendance was technically mandatory for all prisoners regardless of their section or their sentence. In practice, only those on the master's side attended regularly, because they had the means to purchase decent clothes, and because the chapel offered a break from the monotony of their cells. The common side prisoners were brought up in groups, marched into the chapel in chains, and seated in a special section at the back where they could be watched by turnkeys throughout the service. They sat through the prayers and the sermon in silence, some actually listening, most simply enduring another hour of discomfort before being marched back down to their cells. The chaplain's sermons were predictable. Sin leads to suffering, suffering can lead to repentance. Repentance offers the possibility of salvation. He spoke of criminals who had reformed their lives, of prisoners who had found God in Newgate and gone on to live honestly after their release, or to die well if they were condemned. He spoke rarely of the conditions in the prison, of the brutality and disease and injustice, because addressing these topics would have required him to acknowledge his own complicity in a system that profited from suffering. Better to speak of abstract spiritual matters, of the eternal battle between good and evil, of the importance of accepting one's earthly punishment as preparation for the judgment to come. The prisoners listened or did not listen, believed or did not believe, and either way they returned to their cells afterward, and the reality of the stone jug reasserted itself immediately. God might offer salvation in the next life, but in this life there was only stone and iron and the endless waiting for trial or transfer or death. Some prisoners did find genuine religious faith in Newgate, a comfort that helped them endure the unendurable, and their faith was real and valuable to them regardless of its source. Others used religion as a tool, professing conversion to win favour with the chaplain, or to create a more sympathetic impression for their trial. The chaplain could rarely tell the difference and perhaps did not care to try. The daily routine in the stone jug was monotonous to the point of torture. The bread arrived at noon, distributed through the slots in the cell doors by trustees who moved quickly to avoid having their hands grabbed. The chamber. Pots were emptied once a day, usually in the late afternoon, carried out to the cesspit in the yard and then returned still damp and reeking. The exercise period, for those prisoners who were allowed one, lasted 30 minutes and consisted of walking in circles in the small yard under the watch of turnkeys, who carried clubs and used them freely on anyone who stepped out of line or spoke too loudly. The rest of the day stretched out empty, hour after hour with nothing to do and nothing to think about except the predicament that had brought each prisoner to this place. Some prisoners played endless games of cards, using decks so worn that the suits were barely distinguishable. Some gambled, betting on anything that could have an uncertain outcome. How many times a rat would cross the cell before someone could hit it with a shoe, how long a candle would burn, which of them would be called up for trial first. The gambling was mostly for items rather than money, because most prisoners had no money, and the items being wagered, a slightly better blanket, an extra crust of bread, the right to sleep nearest the door where the air was fractionally less foul, were nearly worthless to anyone outside the prison, but precious within it. Some prisoners carved into the walls using whatever tools they could find or fashion, leaving their names and the dates of their confinement and sometimes longer messages. The walls of Newgate were covered with these carvings, centuries of them layered over each other, messages from the dead to the living and from the living to whoever might come after. John Smith was here 1723. God have mercy on William Brown, wrongly accused. Mary Jenkins, innocent. Remember the name of Thomas Wright, who dies Tuesday next. The carvings served no practical purpose, but they satisfied some deep human need to leave a mark, to insist that one had existed, that one's suffering had been real, even if it would soon be forgotten. Others told stories, recounting their crimes or their trials, or simply their lives before Newgate with whatever embellishment made the telling more interesting. the best storytellers became valuable members of their cell communities, providing entertainment that made the hours pass faster and created temporary bonds between people who had nothing else in common except the confinement. The stories followed certain patterns. The criminal who had been clever enough to evade capture for years before one unlucky mistake, the innocent man betrayed by the false witnesses, the woman who had killed in self-defense but could not prove it, the debtor whose business partner had stolen everything and left him to face the creditors alone. How much of these stories was true hardly mattered. The truth was that everyone in Newgate was there because the system had put them there, and whether they deserved their fate or not was a question that the prisoners debated endlessly without ever reaching a conclusion. Some had certainly committed the crimes they were accused of and felt no remorse about it. Others maintained their innocence with a passion that suggested they might actually be telling the truth. Most fell somewhere in between, guilty of something but perhaps not the specific crime that had landed them in the stone jug, or guilty under circumstances that might have excused them in a more merciful legal system. The older prisoners, those who had been in Newgate for months or years, developed a kind of institutional knowledge that they passed on to newcomers. They explained the informal rules: never trust a turnkey's promise, never reveal how much money you have, never admit to being a sex offender, because the other prisoners would beat you to death if they found out. They explained which keepers had been relatively humane and which had been monsters, contributing to an oral history of the prison that stretched back generations. They explained how to survive on minimal food, how to stay warm in winter without a blanket, how to avoid the worst diseases, how to maintain some small portion of sanity in a place designed to break the human spirit. Chapter 6. Newgate Calendar. The broadsheet vendors began assembling outside Newgate's gate before dawn on execution days, claiming their spots along the walls where the crowds would be thickest, arranging their stock in neat piles weighted down with stones against the morning breeze. The sheets were printed overnight, still damp from the press, and they smelled of ink and cheap paper as the vendors unfolded them to check the quality of the impression. The Newgate Calendar, the heading read, in letters large enough to be seen from across the street, and below that the names of those who had hanged that morning, followed by lurid accounts of their crimes, their trials, and their supposed confessions. The calendar was not a single publication, but rather a genre, a type of criminal biography that had existed in various forms since the 16th century and had reached its commercial peak in the Georgian era when literacy was spreading, and the public appetite for true crime seemed bottomless. Dozens of publishers produced versions of the calendar, some as single-sheet broadsides sold for a penny, others as substantial books running to hundreds of pages and costing several shillings. All of them followed the same basic formula: describe the crime in graphic detail, recount the trial, provide a moral lesson about the inevitable consequences of wickedness, and include the criminal's dying speech if possible. The dying speech was the most valuable part of the publication, the element that distinguished a fresh calendar printed on execution day from an old one reprinted from months or years before. The publishers competed viciously for access to the condemned prisoners in their final days, sending writers to Newgate to interview them, offering money to the turnkeys for the privilege of a private conversation in the condemned hold. The chaplain controlled access in theory since the prisoners were under his spiritual care, but he had learned to monetize this control by selling information to multiple publishers and letting them sort out whose account was most accurate. The condemned prisoners understood the value of their stories and used them as their final currency. A prisoner who gave a good account to a writer could negotiate for small comforts in his last days: better food, a blanket, sometimes a visit from family members who would not otherwise have been permitted into the condemned hold. Some prisoners dictated elaborate confessions that were clearly designed to make their crimes seem more dramatic or themselves more sympathetic. Others maintained their innocence to the end, insisting that they were victims of mistaken identity or perjured testimony, and these protestations of innocence were duly recorded and published alongside the evidence that had convinced the jury otherwise. The writers who produced the calendar were not journalists in any modern sense, but rather commercial authors who understood that their job was to sell papers, not to uncover truth. They embellished freely, adding dialogue that had never been spoken, describing thoughts that the criminals had never shared, inventing details that made the story more compelling. The format demanded certain narrative elements. The criminal must come from a good family that he disappointed, or from a bad family that explained his corruption. There must be a moment of temptation when he made the fatal choice to commit the crime. There must be a chase or a capture scene with dramatic tension. The trial must include stirring speeches by the prosecutor and perhaps a moving plea by the defence. The confession must include remorse and acknowledgement of divine justice. These formulaic elements were familiar to readers who bought the calendar regularly, but familiarity did not breed contempt. Quite the opposite. Readers wanted the comfort of the expected pattern, the reassurance that crime led to punishment, and punishment to either repentance or damnation. The calendar served a cultural function beyond mere entertainment, acting as a kind of moral instruction manual that taught what behaviours society condemned and what consequences would follow. Parents read the calendar to their children as cautionary tales. Masters read it to their apprentices. Preachers quoted from it in sermons. It was didactic literature disguised as sensational storytelling, and it was phenomenally successful. The most popular criminals became celebrities, their names known across England, their stories told and retold until fact and legend became indistinguishable. Jonathan Wild, the self-proclaimed thief-taker general who ran London's criminal underworld while posing as a public servant, had been hanged in 1725, and his calendar entry remained a bestseller for decades afterward. Dick Turpin, the highwayman whose actual crimes were brutal and unglamorous but whose calendar legend transformed him into a romantic figure, sold calendars by the thousands. Claude Duval, the French highwayman who supposedly robbed with such gallantry that ladies swooned at his charm, had been dead since 1670, but his calendar entry was reprinted continuously for over a century. The female criminals in the calendar received special attention, their crimes examined through the lens of contemporary attitudes about women and morality. A woman who murdered was portrayed as particularly depraved, having violated not only the law but also her essential nature as the gentler sex. A woman who stole was depicted as having been led astray by vanity, or by a wicked man who corrupted her. A woman who killed her husband was a monster, deserving no sympathy regardless of how he had treated her. The calendar's treatment of female criminals revealed the deep misogyny of the era, but it also provided one of the few spaces where women's voices, however mediated and manipulated, could be heard in the historical record. Mary Blandy was perhaps the most famous female criminal of the mid-18th century, a young woman of respectable family who poisoned her father in 1751 after he refused to allow her to marry her chosen suitor. Her trial attracted enormous attention, her execution drew a crowd of thousands, and her calendar entry, Pompishi, went through multiple editions. The writers portrayed her as a victim of her own passions, seduced by a scoundrel and driven to murder by love and desperation. Whether this portrayal bore any resemblance to Mary Blandy's actual thoughts and feelings was impossible to determine, but it made for a compelling narrative that satisfied readers' expectations of how a woman murderer should be explained. The execution day itself was carefully choreographed to provide maximum material for the calendar publishers. The condemned prisoners were brought out of Newgate at 8 in the morning, loaded onto open carts and paraded through the streets to Tyburn where the gallows waited. The route was fixed, always the same, out through Newgate, along Holborn, up Tyburn Road. 3 miles that took 2 hours or more depending on the size of the crowd. The prisoners were encouraged to behave with courage and dignity, to wave to the crowds, to deliver speeches from the cart if they felt moved to do so. Everything they said or did would be recorded and sold, and they knew it. The writers followed the carts on horseback or in carriages, taking notes, observing the prisoner's demeanour, listening for any final words. They noted what the condemned wore, the clean white shirt provided by the prison, any personal items they had been allowed to keep, whether they appeared calm or terrified, defiant or resigned. They described the reactions of the crowds that lined the route, the weeping family members, the vendors selling gin and pies, the pickpockets working the dense throngs. All of this would be woven into the calendar. Accounts published that afternoon, still warm from the press. At Tyburn, the gallows stood permanent and massive, a triangular wooden structure capable of hanging 24 people simultaneously, 8 to a side. The condemned prisoners were taken from the carts and positioned under the beams, nooses placed around their necks, and given a final opportunity to address the crowd. Some delivered prepared speeches, others managed only a few words, many said nothing at all. The hangman and his assistants moved efficiently, checking the ropes, positioning the prisoners, and when everything was ready, the carts that had brought them from Newgate were driven away, leaving the prisoners hanging. Death by hanging was neither quick nor clean, despite what the calendar accounts sometimes suggested. The condemned dropped only a short distance, not enough to break the neck, and they died slowly by strangulation, their bodies convulsing, their faces turning purple, their bladders and bowels releasing. The crowd watched all of this, some with horror, some with apparent pleasure, many simply with the curiosity of people witnessing something extraordinary. The bodies hung for an hour before being cut down, loaded into the coffins that had come from Newgate on the same carts, and taken away for burial. But before the bodies could be buried, some were claimed by the surgeons. The Murder Act of 1752 stipulated that the bodies of executed murderers must be either hanged in chains as a warning or delivered to the surgeons for dissection, and most families chose dissection as the lesser horror. The bodies were taken to Surgeons' Hall, where medical students and physicians would cut them apart to study anatomy, a punishment that extended beyond death and reflected the belief that the criminal body belonged to the state even after the soul had departed. The calendar accounts describe these dissections in detail, noting which organs were diseased, what the surgeons had discovered, using medical language to add a veneer of scientific authority to what was essentially posthumous mutilation. The calendar's influence extended far beyond its immediate sales. The criminal biographies became source material for ballads and plays, for novels and poems, for sermons and moral treatises. The stories entered oral tradition, told and retold in alehouses and workshops, changing with each telling, until the original facts were buried under layers of elaboration. Dick Turpin's ride from London to York on his horse-black Bess was pure invention, created by a novelist decades after the actual highwayman died. But it became so famous that most people believed it had really happened. The calendar also influenced the behaviour of criminals themselves, creating a feedback loop between published crime stories and actual crimes. Young men who had read the calendar's romantic accounts of highwaymen sometimes took to the roads themselves, modelling their robberies on what they had read, hoping to achieve the same fame as their literary heroes. The calendar condemned crime while simultaneously glamorizing criminals, and this contradiction was never resolved or even acknowledged by the publishers who profited from it. The authorities viewed the calendar with ambivalence. On one hand, the public executions and the publicity surrounding them were meant to serve as deterrents, warnings of what awaited those who broke the law. On the other hand, the calendar seemed to be teaching people how to commit crimes, providing detailed descriptions of criminal methods and techniques, and sometimes portraying criminals as more clever and interesting than the constables and magistrates who caught them. But the calendar was too popular and too profitable to suppress, and besides, the authorities themselves used it, reading the accounts to learn about criminal networks and methods, studying the confessions for information about accomplices who might still be at large. The condemned prisoners sometimes used their calendar accounts to settle scores or reveal secrets, knowing that the publication would reach people they could no longer contact directly. A prisoner might use his dying confession to accuse someone of a crime, to implicate former partners, to send messages to family or friends. These deathbed accusations were impossible to verify and often motivated by revenge rather than truth, but they were published anyway because they made the accounts more interesting, and newspapers had no concept of libel protection for the dead. By the late 18th century, the calendar had become a permanent fixture of English culture, as familiar and expected as the executions themselves. New editions appeared after every hanging day, Old editions were collected and bound into volumes. Anthologies compiled the most famous cases from decades past. The reading public had an apparently insatiable appetite for these stories of crime and punishment, sin and retribution, and the publishers continued to supply what the market demanded. Chapter 7. The Ordinary's Account. The Reverend James Ford descended the 15 steps to the condemned hold carrying a leather-bound notebook, a pen case and a small bottle of ink stoppered with cork. His lantern swung from his left hand, casting shadows that climbed the walls and retreated with each step, and his shoes scraped against stone worn smooth by 2 centuries of similar descents. Ford had been the Ordinary of Newgate for 6 years, appointed to the position in 1768 after the death of his predecessor, and he had conducted these interviews more than 300 times. The routine had become so familiar that he no longer felt the dread that had accompanied his first visits to the condemned, no longer flinched at the smell that rolled up from below, no longer hesitated before unlocking the iron door that separated the living from the almost dead. He had become, through repetition and necessity, a professional harvester of finals, words, and he was very good at his work. The condemned hold contained 7 prisoners on this particular Tuesday in March 1774, 3 men and 4 women, all sentenced to hang on Friday morning. They had been tried at the Old Bailey the previous week, their cases heard in rapid succession as the court worked through the backlog of accused that had accumulated since the last hanging day. 2 of the men were housebreakers, caught with stolen silver in their possession and identified by witnesses. The 3rd man was a coiner, arrested with moulds for making counterfeit shillings, a crime that the law treated as treason because it undermined the king's currency. The women had been convicted of various offences: theft, receiving stolen goods, keeping a disorderly house, and in one case infanticide, the killing of a newborn child whose body had been found in a cesspit. They sat or lay on the stone floor as Ford entered, some looking up at the lantern light with expressions of desperate hope, others remaining motionless as if already dead. Ford set the lantern on the floor where its light would reach most of the chamber, opened his notebook to a fresh page, uncorked his ink bottle, and prepared his pen. He knew which prisoner he would interview first. The infanticide case would sell the most copies, and he always began with the most commercially promising subject. The woman was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair that had not been combed or washed in the week since her trial. She wore a dress of coarse brown wool stained and torn, and she had wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket that provided no warmth, but created the illusion of privacy. Ford approached her slowly, speaking in the gentle pastoral voice he had perfected for these occasions, and asked her name, though he already knew it from the trial records. "Sarah Mills," she said, and her voice was so quiet that Ford had to lean closer to hear. He asked her age, and she said 21. He asked if she understood why she had been sentenced to death, and she nodded without speaking. Ford settled himself on the stone floor across from her, balancing his notebook on his knee, and began the interrogation that would become the centerpiece of his next published account. He asked her to tell him about her life, starting from childhood, and Sarah Mills began to speak in a halting monotone that suggested she had retreated somewhere inside herself where the reality of Friday morning could not quite reach. She had been born in a village in Hertfordshire, the daughter of a labourer who worked on the estate of a gentleman whose name Ford recognised and carefully recorded. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, her father had remarried, and the stepmother had not wanted her in the house. At 14 she'd gone into service, working as a scullery maid for a family in London, sleeping in a basement room with 3 other servants, rising before dawn to light fires and carry water and scrub pots until her hands cracked and bled. Ford wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the page, capturing the details that would make the account feel authentic and allow readers to see Sarah Mills as a real person rather than an abstract criminal. The service had been hard but bearable until the son of the house had noticed her. She did not say what had happened next, but Ford did not need her to elaborate. He had heard this story in various forms dozens of times before and knew how it ended. The son had forced himself on her. She had become pregnant. She had hidden the pregnancy as long as possible by lacing her stays tighter and wearing loose dresses, but eventually the housekeeper had noticed, and she had been dismissed without a character reference. No character meant no new position. No position meant no income meant the street or the workhouse, and Sarah Mills had chosen the street. She had given birth alone in a stable behind a coaching inn, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, and the child had been born too early and too small and had not breathed, no matter what she tried to make it breathe. Ford asked her directly whether she had killed the child, and she insisted she had not, that it had been born dead, but the law presumed that any unmarried woman who concealed a pregnancy and whose child died had murdered it unless she could prove otherwise. Sarah Mills had no proof, no witnesses, no one who would testify that she had tried to save the infant rather than smother it. The body had been found 3 days later, when the stench led someone to investigate the cesspit where she had hidden it, and the constables had tracked her down through inquiries at the coaching inn. The trial had lasted less than an hour. The jury had deliberated for 10 minutes. The judge had pronounced the death sentence with barely concealed disgust, commenting that infanticide was the most unnatural crime a woman could commit, and that mercy would be an insult to the innocent life she had destroyed. Ford wrote all of this down, occasionally asking clarifying questions, guiding her story toward the moral framework that the account required. He asked if she regretted her actions, and she said she regretted everything, her entire life, every choice she had made or failed to make. He asked if she believed God could forgive such a sin, and she began to weep, saying she hoped so but did not know, that the chaplain at the trial had told her she was damned, but she wanted to believe there was mercy somewhere even for her. Ford made careful note of this response because it perfectly captured the tension his readers expected. The struggle between despair and hope, the human need for forgiveness contrasted with the enormity of the crime. He would expand this section in the published account, adding scriptural references and perhaps inventing a longer conversation in which he had guided her toward repentance and acceptance of God's judgment. The truth of what she had actually said mattered less than the moral narrative the account needed to construct. He spent 2 hours with Sarah Mills, extracting every detail of her story that might be useful, and then moved on to the next prisoner. The coiner was less cooperative, insisting that he had been framed by a business partner who had provided the moulds, and then informed on him to collect the reward. Ford recorded this claim but marked it in his notes as likely false, knowing that denial was common among the condemned and that readers preferred confessions to protestations of innocence. The housebreakers admitted their crime freely, even boasting about other burglaries they had committed and escaped punishment for, and Ford wrote down these additional confessions knowing they would make good material. One of the women, the keeper of the disorderly house, refused to speak to him at all, turning her face to the wall and remaining silent no matter what questions he asked. Ford noted her obstinacy and made a mental note to describe it in the account as evidence of an unrepentant heart hardened by years of sinful living. By the time Ford climbed back up the 15 steps and emerged into the keeper's lodge, he had filled 20 pages in his notebook with cramped handwriting that he would need to transcribe and expand before the execution. The work of creating the account would occupy him for the next 3 days, writing late into the night by candlelight, shaping the raw material of the prisoner's stories into the polished narrative that readers expected. He worked from a formula he had perfected over 6 years and hundreds of cases, beginning each biography with the prisoner's birth and early life, tracing the path that led them into crime, describing the offence in sufficient detail to be interesting without being so graphic as to offend delicate sensibilities, recounting the trial and verdict, and concluding with the prisoner's spiritual state and their final words at the gallows. The Ordinary's account was published under Ford's name and presented as an authoritative document, the official record of the condemned prisoner's last days compiled by the spiritual advisor who administered to them. In reality, it was a commercial product designed to maximize sales, and Ford understood this perfectly. He was paid a small salary by the city for his role as chaplain, but the real income came from the account, which he owned and published himself, keeping all the profits after paying the printer and the distributors. A good execution, meaning one that featured interesting criminals or particularly heinous crimes, could earn him £50 or more in sales, equivalent to a year's salary for a curate. A spectacular execution, something like the hanging of a notorious murderer, or a criminal whose case had captured public attention, could earn several times that amount. Ford was not unique in monetizing his position. Every ordinary of Newgate since the early 17th century had published accounts, and the tradition had become so established that the prisoners themselves expected it. Some even cooperated enthusiastically, seeing the account as their opportunity to tell their side of the story, to achieve a kind of immortality through print, to ensure that their names would be remembered after their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves or dissected on the surgeon's table. Others resented being turned into entertainment, being reduced to material for a pamphlet that would be read and discarded. But they had little choice. The ordinary controlled access to the condemned hold, controlled the schedule of visits and religious services, and prisoners who refused to cooperate might find themselves denied small comforts or cut off from family visits in their final days. The relationship between the ordinary and the condemned was complicated, layered with conflicting purposes and mutual exploitation. Ford genuinely believed he was providing spiritual counsel, preparing the prisoners for death, offering them the possibility of salvation through repentance and acceptance of Christ. He prayed with them, read scripture, administered communion, and performed the rituals of his office with sincerity, but he was also extracting their stories for profit, packaging their suffering for public consumption, and he seemed to feel no contradiction between these roles. The prisoners understood this duality and responded to it in various ways. Some treated him as a genuine spiritual advisor. Others saw him as merely another person profiting from their misery. Most probably felt both things at once and adjusted their responses accordingly. The account that Ford published after the March 1774 execution ran to 16 pages, printed on cheap paper with a woodcut illustration on the title page, showing the Tyburn gallows with stick figures hanging from the beams. Sarah Mill's case occupied the first 6 pages, her story told with pathetic detail designed to evoke both sympathy and moral censure. Ford had expanded her brief answers into lengthy passages of introspection and regret, putting words in her mouth that she had never spoken but that served the narrative he was constructing. He described her as a cautionary example of how one sin, the sin of fornication, though Ford carefully avoided blaming the gentleman's son who had forced her, led inevitably to worse sins, how concealment bred more concealment until murder became the terrible culmination of a chain of wickedness. He included a section on her final hours before execution, describing her as calm and resigned, praying continuously, expressing gratitude for the mercy of God even as she prepared to face his judgment. Whether any of this was accurate was impossible to verify, because Ford was the only witness to most of these conversations and he alone controlled what was published. The account sold well. The combination of infanticide and a young female, criminal guaranteed strong sales, and Ford's printer reported that the first edition of 500 copies had sold out by noon on execution day, requiring a second printing that afternoon. Ford calculated his profits and was satisfied. The March execution had been financially successful, and he had already begun preparing for the next hanging day in April, when a new group of condemned prisoners would provide fresh material for another account. The cycle continued without variation, week after week, month after month, year after year, and Ford grew wealthy from the harvest of final words. The prisoners who were executed that Friday morning behaved much as Ford had predicted in his account. Sarah Mills stood quietly in the cart as it rolled along Holborn toward Tyburn, her hands bounded in front of her, her face pale but composed. She spoke no final words from the gallows, only nodding when the hangman asked if she was ready. The crowd that had gathered to watch was large, but not unusually so, perhaps 3,000 people, and they maintained a respectful near silence as the carts pulled away and the condemned began their slow strangulation. Mills died after approximately 8 minutes, her body going limp as her brain was starved of oxygen, and she was cut down and placed in her coffin and delivered to Surgeons' Hall, where medical students would spend the afternoon cutting her apart to study the anatomy of reproduction and what it revealed about the crime of infanticide. The other condemned died in similar fashion, their deaths recorded briefly in the newspapers and more extensively in Ford's account, and by evening they had been reduced to corpses, to cautionary tales, to entries in the ledgers of death that Newgate maintained with bureaucratic precision. Ford returned to his comfortable rooms above the prison and began preparing for Sunday's service. He would preach on the themes of sin and redemption, using the recent executions as illustrative examples, reminding his congregation of free citizens and imprisoned criminals alike that the wages of sin were death, but the gift of God was eternal life through Jesus Christ. He would not mention the money he had made from publishing the account, would not acknowledge the contradiction between his roles as spiritual counselor and commercial publisher, would not question whether a system that profited from suffering could truly serve the cause of justice or mercy. These were not questions that troubled him, or if they did, he had learned to ignore them. The work continued, the cycle repeated, and the Ordinary's account remained one of the most popular publications in London, read by thousands who would never see the inside of Newgate, but who consumed the stories that emerged from it, with an appetite that seemed inexhaustible. Chapter 8. The Triple Tree. The carpenter's name was Thomas Turles, and he had been maintaining the Tyburn Gallows for 16 years, a position he had inherited from his father, who had held it before him for 23 years, making the Turles family responsible for London's most famous structure for nearly 4 decades. The gallows stood at the junction where Tyburn Road met what would later be called Edgware Road, a location chosen because it was outside the city proper, but still easily accessible, close enough that crowds could walk from central London, but far enough that the executions did not disrupt commerce in the more respectable districts. The structure was permanent, rebuilt in 1571 during the reign of Elizabeth, and maintained continuously since then. A massive triangular frame of oak beams, each 20 feet long and supported by 3 uprights that rose 18 feet above the ground. The design allowed for 8 prisoners to be hanged simultaneously from each beam, 24 in total if necessary, though that capacity was rarely used even on the busiest execution days. The wood was weather-darkened almost to black, stained with tannin and rain and something else that might have been the bodily fluids of the hundreds who had died there, and it had acquired over the centuries a kind of terrible sanctity, a presence that made it recognisable from a distance, even to those who had never seen it before. Turles checked the beams every Monday morning, walking around the perimeter with a ladder and a toolkit, examining the joints where the horizontals met the uprights, testing the iron brackets that secured everything together, replacing any rope that showed signs of fraying or rot. The work was straightforward but essential, because a gallows failure during an execution would be a public embarrassment for the cities, and potentially a legal complication if a prisoner survived a hanging due to equipment malfunction. The law required that a condemned prisoner be hanged until dead, and if the first attempt failed, the prisoner had to be hanged again. But there were old superstitions about the meaning of a failed execution, and Turles took pride in ensuring that his gallows never failed. He kept detailed records of every execution, noting the date, the number of condemned, the weather conditions, and any unusual circumstances, records that he stored in a wooden chest in his workshop along with the tools of his trade, extra rope in coils, spare iron brackets, mallets and nails and planes for wood repair, even a collection of the personal effects that condemned prisoners sometimes left behind in the carts and that no one else claimed. The execution ritual began at Newgate, where the condemned were prepared, but it truly commenced when the prison bell began tolling at 8 in the morning, a slow measured rhythm that could be heard across half of London, and that signalled the start of the procession. The carts emerged from the prison gate in single file, each pulled by a single horse led by a guard on foot, and they turned west onto Holborn, while the crowd that had been gathering since before dawn pressed close. On all sides, the condemned sat or stood in the carts depending on their strength and their willingness to maintain dignity, and they wore the white shirts that Newgate provided, along with whatever other clothing they owned or had been given by family. Some wore their best coats and hats, determined to die as gentlemen even if they had lived as criminals. Others wore rags, having nothing better, and a few wore deliberate costumes, theatrical outfits that made a statement or created a character. The highwayman in riding clothes, the pirate in a tricorn hat, the prostitute in rouge and ribbons who refused to pretend she was anything other than what she was. The crowd responded to these performances with cheers or jeers depending on the criminal's reputation and the mood of the mob, and the condemned responded in turn, waving or bowing or sometimes cursing, playing their final role in the theatre of justice. The procession moved slowly because the crowds made faster movement impossible, and because the ritual demanded a certain pace, a gravity appropriate to the occasion. The route was fixed by tradition and law, west on Holborn, past the churches and shops and taverns, past the houses of merchants and the tenements of the poor, through neighbourhoods where people knew the schedule and came out to watch or stayed inside with shutters closed depending on their temperament. The cart stopped 3 times during the journey at taverns, where the condemned were offered a final drink, a custom so established that the tavern keepers had the ale ready and waiting, and charged the city a standard fee for the service. Some prisoners drank eagerly, downing several pints in quick succession in hopes that intoxication would dull the terror of what was coming. Others refused, wanting to face death with clear minds, or perhaps simply unable to swallow with the knowledge of the noose waiting at the end of the road. The stops added another 30 minutes to the journey, stretching the procession to 2 hours or more, and this too was intentional. The theory being that maximum exposure of the condemned to public view would maximize the deterrent effect. But deterrence was not the only purpose the procession served, perhaps not even the primary purpose. The journey from Newgate to Tyburn was entertainment, spectacle, theatre, played out on the streets of London, with the city itself as the stage. The crowd that lined the route and followed the carts numbered in the thousands on ordinary hanging days and could swell to tens of thousands when the condemned included someone famous or someone whose crime had captured public imagination. People climbed onto roofs and walls for better views, leaned from windows, stood on barrels and carts, pushed and shoved for position. Vendors worked the crowd, selling pies and gin and printed copies of the condemned prisoners' supposed last confessions, and pickpockets worked the crowd as well, understanding that distracted spectators made easy marks and that the press of bodies provided perfect cover for their craft. The irony of crimes being committed at an event designed to demonstrate the consequences of crime was apparently lost on everyone. Or perhaps it simply did not matter, the moral lesson of the gallows being less interesting than the immediate opportunities the crowd presented. The condemned prisoners could see all of this, could observe the carnival atmosphere that surrounded their death procession, and their reactions varied. Some seemed to draw energy from the crowd, sitting up straighter, smiling, responding to calls from the spectators. Others withdrew into themselves, eyes closed or staring at nothing, trying to retreat into some interior space where the reality of what was happening could not quite penetrate. A few wept openly, tears running down faces that had been washed that morning in the prison, but were now filmed with the dust that the carts kicked up from the unpaved sections of road. Children ran alongside the carts, reaching up to touch the wheels, daring each other to get closer, and their mothers either pulled them back or encouraged them forward depending on whether they thought the spectacle would serve as useful moral instruction or dangerous entertainment. The condemned could speak during the procession if they chose, and some did, delivering speeches to the crowd that ranged from the defiant to the penitent. A highwayman might shout that he regretted nothing, that he had lived free and would die free, that the gentlemen who condemned him were greater thieves than he had ever been because they stole under the protection of law. A murderer might proclaim his innocence, describing the witnesses who had lied and the judge who had been prejudiced and the jury that had been swayed by emotion rather than evidence. A thief might beg forgiveness from those he had robbed, might ask the crowd to pray for his soul, might weep and confess and throw himself on the mercy of God in a display that was either genuine or calculated depending on the individual and the circumstances. The crowd listened to these speeches with varying degrees of attention and sympathy, cheering or booing as their judgment dictated, and everything that was said was recorded by the writers who followed the carts taking notes for the next edition of the Newgate calendar. The approach to Tyburn was marked by a change in the crowd's behaviour, a shift from festive chaos to something more focused and predatory. The spectators who had followed from Newgate pressed forward, wanting to secure good positions near the gallows, and the spectators who had been waiting at Tyburn surged toward the approaching carts. The junction where the gallows stood was surrounded by specially built viewing stands, wooden bleachers that landlords erected on hanging days and rented by the seat, with prices varying based on proximity to the gallows and quality of the view. The stands closest to the gallows commanded premium prices, sometimes as much as 10 shillings for a seat, and they filled with the prosperous and the curious who wanted to see death up close, but from the safety of an elevated position. The stands further back were cheaper, available to shopkeepers and clerks and anyone else who could afford a few pennies for the entertainment. The very poor watched from ground level, standing in the mud and the horse manure, jostling for position, sometimes fighting each other for better views. Turles was always present on execution days, arriving early to perform his final inspection of the gallows and to brief the hangman on any issues that might affect the procedure. The hangman was a city employee, appointed by the sheriffs, paid a small salary and whatever additional income he could extract from the condemned and their families. The current hangman was a man named Edward Dennis, who had held the position since 1771 and had overseen more than 200 executions. Dennis was efficient and businesslike, treating his work as a craft that required skill and attention to detail, and he had developed methods for managing the mechanics of multiple simultaneous hangings. He arrived at Tyburn an hour before the carts, checked Turles's work, inspected the ropes that would be used that day, and prepared the nooses with careful attention to the placement of the knot, which would affect how quickly the prisoner died. The carts arrived at Tyburn shortly after 10 in the morning, having taken 2 hours to cover the 3 miles from Newgate, and they were positioned directly beneath the beams with the horses still in harness. The condemned prisoners were left standing or sitting in the carts while Dennis and his assistants climbed up beside them and placed the nooses around their necks, adjusting the knots and checking that the ropes were the correct length. Too short and the prisoner would not drop far enough to ensure death by strangulation. Too long and they might hit the ground, which would be both undignified and ineffective. Dennis had calculated the optimal rope length through years of experience, adjusting for each prisoner's height and weight, and he took pride in his precision. While he worked, the prison chaplain stood nearby reading from his prayer book, reciting the commendation of the dying that committed their souls to God's mercy. Though whether the condemned could hear or understand the words over the noise of the crowd was doubtful. The condemned were given a final opportunity to address the crowd from the carts, a tradition that dated back centuries and that some prisoners used to deliver elaborate speeches. The most famous dying speech in English history had been delivered from the scaffold at Tyburn in 1785 when the Duke of Monmouth, convicted of treason, had spoken for nearly 20 minutes before being beheaded. Common criminals rarely achieved such eloquence, but they tried, standing in the carts with nooses around their necks and attempting to find words adequate to the enormity of the moment. Some succeeded in delivering moving final statements that were recorded and remembered. Most managed only a few broken sentences before emotional terror overwhelmed them, and they could speak no more. A few said nothing at all, either from choice or from an inability to form words, and these silences were interpreted by the crowd according to their predispositions as evidence of guilt and shame, or of innocence and injustice, or simply of human weakness in the face of death. When the speeches were finished, or when it became clear that no more speeches would be forthcoming, the hangman signalled to his assistants, and they pulled white hoods over the faces of the condemned, covering their eyes and mouths, transforming them from individuals into anonymous figures in white. Then the executioner raised his hand, held it aloft for a moment that seemed to stretch and distort time itself, and dropped it. The drivers of the carts whipped their horses, the carts lurched forward out from under the condemned, and the bodies dropped, jerked by the ropes, and began their dying. The crowd roared, a sound that combined excitement and horror and satisfaction, and everyone pressed forward to see better, to witness the convulsions, to observe death in its rawest form. Some watched with clinical interest, noting the movements of the bodies, timing how long it took for each prisoner to stop struggling. Others watched with apparent pleasure, as if the suffering of the condemned provided some cathartic release. Many watched with a kind of horrified fascination, unable to look away despite the grotesque spectacle, drawn by the same impulse that makes people slow down to observe accidents. The bodies hung for an hour as required by law, swaying slightly in whatever breeze might be blowing, and during that hour the crowd remained, though the composition changed as some spectators left and others arrived. Dennis and his assistant stood guard beneath the gallows, preventing anyone from approaching too closely, because there was a belief that touching a hanged man brought good luck or cured certain diseases, and if the guards were not vigilant, people would rush forward to grab the feet of the corpses. When the hour elapsed, the bodies were cut down and loaded into the coffins that had been brought from Newgate on the carts, and then they were either delivered to Surgeons' Hall for dissection or taken to burial grounds depending on the sentence and the availability of family to claim them. The coffins disappeared, the crowd dispersed, and Turles performed his post-execution inspection, checking for any damage to the gallows structure and making notes about repairs that might be needed before the next hanging day. The triple tree, as Tyburn was sometimes called in reference to its three-sided design, had been the site of more than 2,000 executions by the time the 18th century ended, and it would claim hundreds more before public opinion finally turned against the spectacle, and the gallows were moved to Newgate itself, where executions could be conducted with more decorum and less entertainment value. But in the decades when the procession from Newgate to Tyburn was a regular feature of London life, the journey and the hanging were woven into the fabric of the city, references to them appearing in literature and songs, the route itself becoming known as the Road to Tyburn, a phrase that meant not just a geographic direction, but a moral destination, the inevitable end for those who lived outside the law. The gallows stood as a permanent reminder of the power of the state to take life, of the consequences that awaited the condemned, of the thin line that separated the spectators from the spectacle. And Thomas Turles maintained his gallows with care, understanding that he was not merely preserving a structure, but maintaining an institution, ensuring that the machinery of justice continued to function with the terrible efficiency that the law demanded and the public expected. Chapter 9. The Fires of Reform. The summer of 1780 was uncommonly hot, the kind of heat that settled over London like a weight and refused to lift even at night, leaving the city parched and irritable and waiting for something to break. The political tension had been building for months, fueled by paranoia about Catholic influence in government and by the inflammatory rhetoric of Lord George Gordon, who had founded the Protestant Association and who spoke at rallies about the threat posed by the Catholic Relief Act of 1778. The act had been modest, merely lifting some of the most onerous restrictions that prevented Catholics from owning property or serving in the military. But Gordon and his followers portrayed it as the first step toward Catholic domination of England and the restoration of papal authority. They gathered petitions, organised protests, and on Friday the 2nd of June, Gordon led a march of 50,000 people through the streets of London to present their grievances to Parliament. The march was peaceful at first, an enormous procession of respectable artisans and shopkeepers wearing blue cockades to identify themselves as Protestant patriots, but when Parliament dismissed their petition without serious consideration, the disappointment and anger that had been carefully channeled into political expression suddenly exploded into violence. The riots began that evening and continued for 6 days, transforming London into a battlefield between mobs and authority. The targets were initially Catholic chapels and the homes of prominent Catholics, but the violence quickly expanded to include anyone or anything associated with wealth or power. The rioters burned the Sardinian Embassy Chapel, destroyed the house of Lord Mansfield, who had supported the Catholic Relief Act, attacked distilleries and breweries and helped themselves to the alcohol, which only intensified the chaos. The city authorities seemed paralysed, uncertain whether the riots constituted a legitimate political protest that it should be tolerated, or a criminal uprising that demanded suppression. The Lord Mayor hesitated to call out the troops, fearing that using military force against civilian protesters would spark even greater violence, and in the absence of effective response the riots spread and intensified. By Monday evening, London was burning in a dozen places, flames rising into the summer sky, and the mobs had grown bold enough to attack not just Catholic targets, but the very symbols of state authority, including the prisons that held those accused and convicted of crimes. Newgate was an obvious target. The prison sat in the heart of the city, visible to everyone who passed along Holborn or through Smithfield Market, a constant reminder of the power the state wielded over those who broke its laws. The rioters who converged on Newgate on Tuesday evening were a mixed group, some motivated by anti-Catholic sentiment because the prison held Catholics arrested during the earlier riots, some by a more general hatred of authority, some simply by the opportunity for destruction that the chaos provided. They arrived carrying torches and tools, several hundred strong, and they demanded that the keeper release all Catholic prisoners immediately. The keeper, whose name was Akerman and who had held the position for 9 years, refused. He pointed out that he had no authority to release prisoners without orders from the courts, that the prisoners in Newgate were not all Catholic, and that many were condemned for crimes that had nothing to do with religion, and that surrendering the prison to a mob would be dereliction of his duty. The crowd listened to these explanations and then attacked. They began by trying to break down the main gate, attacking it with hammers and crowbars, but the gate was iron-banded oak designed to resist exactly this kind of assault, and it held firm. The rioters brought up a cart and used it as a battering ram, hammering it repeatedly into the gate while others threw stones and bottles at the windows. The keeper and the turnkeys retreated inside, barricading themselves in the upper floors, while the prisoners in the cells below began shouting and rattling their chains, some calling for rescue, others simply adding their voices to the general chaos. The rioters realized that frontal assault would not work and changed tactics, deciding to burn the prison open. They gathered furniture from nearby houses, piled it against the walls, poured oil and spirits over everything and set it alight. The flames caught quickly in the dry heat of June, climbing the walls, finding gaps in the stonework, seeking entry. The fire spread with terrifying speed through a building that was essentially a medieval structure overlaid with centuries of modifications and additions, a warren of wooden floors and doors and furniture all seasoned dry by time. The main gate finally yielded to the flames, the oak charring and cracking, and the rioters surged through into the keeper's lodge and began searching for keys. They found some, but not all, because Akerman had hidden the master keys before fleeing, and so they simply broke down the doors they could not unlock, using axes and hammers to smash through wood and even stone in their frenzy to release the prisoners. The first prisoners to emerge were from the master's side, the better cells near the front of the prison, and they stumbled out into the smoky darkness, blinking and disoriented, some still in chains because there were no keys to remove them. The rioters cheered and urged them to run, to disappear into the city before order could be restored, and most did run, vanishing into the narrow streets and alleys around Smithfield while the prison burned behind them. The common side was deeper in the building and harder to reach, separated from the front sections by multiple locked doors and the growing fire. The prisoners in those cells could hear the riot and smell the smoke, and they began screaming for help, throwing themselves against the doors, trying desperately to attract attention before the fire reached them. A group of rioters managed to fight their way through the smoke to the stairway that led down to the common side, and they descended into darkness so thick that their torches barely penetrated it, feeling their way along walls that were already hot to the touch. They found the door and attacked it with axes, chopping through the iron-banded oak in a fury of effort that took nearly 20 minutes. And when the door finally gave way, they were met by a surge of prisoners who poured out and up the stairs toward the courtyard and freedom. Behind them, the fire had found the wooden structures inside the prison, the floors and beams and furniture, and it was consuming everything, the heat growing so intense that stone itself began to crack. The condemned hold was beneath the chapel, and its door was particularly heavy, designed to be opened only from outside and secured with locks that required multiple keys. The prisoners trapped there could hear the riot above and around them, but could see nothing, and they had no way of knowing whether rescue would reach them before the fire did. They shouted and screamed and beat on the door until their hands bled, and they prayed, many of them praying more fervently than they had during any of the chaplain's visits, bargaining with God for a reprieve from the sentence that had seemed so certain just hours before. The rioters who had freed the common-side prisoners tried to reach the condemned hold, but the heat and smoke drove them back. and they might have abandoned the effort except that other prisoners who'd been freed directed them to the chapel entrance. A group fought their way into the chapel, which was burning fiercely, the wooden pews and the carved pulpit and the chaplain's desk all ablaze, and they found the trapdoor that led down to the condemned hold. They pulled it open and were met by a blast of smoke and heat that had been trapped in the stairwell, and by the voices of the condemned prisoners screaming for help 15 steps below. 2 rioters descended into that smoke, covering their faces with wet rags, and they attacked the door to the condemned hold with axes, chopping blindly in the dark and the smoke, stopping only when they heard the prisoners shouting that the door was giving way. When it finally broke open, the 7 condemned prisoners who had been scheduled to hang on Friday surged out and up the stairs, climbing toward air and light and the impossible gift of continued life. They emerged into the burning chapel and were guided by the rioters through the flames to the courtyard, and then out through the shattered gate into the street. The crowds that filled the streets around Newgate cheered as prisoners continued to emerge, some helping to remove chains, some offering clothes to replace prison uniforms, many simply watching the spectacle of the great prison burning and emptying and losing its power to confine. More than 300 prisoners escaped from Newgate that night, including murderers and thieves and debtors and political prisoners and the 7 condemned who had expected to die at week's end. The prison burned for hours, the flames visible across London, and the fire spread to nearby buildings despite efforts by neighbours to create fire breaks. The ancient Roman stones cracked in the heat, walls collapsed, floors fell through into the cells below, and by dawn on Wednesday what remained of Newgate was a smoking shell, the gates gone, the roof gone, the interior completely destroyed. The keeper stood in the street and watched his prison burn, having lost everything, his position, his income, his home, all of it consumed in a single night of chaos. The prisoners who had been freed scattered across London and beyond, and some recaptured in the days that followed, many never seen again, disappearing into the anonymity that the great city provided for those who wished to vanish. The authorities responded to the riots with overwhelming force once they finally decided to act. King George III authorised the use of military force without waiting for civil magistrates to read the Riot Act, and troops poured into London from barracks around the country. They confronted the mobs in a running battles through the streets, firing volley after volley into crowds that fought back with stones and clubs and stolen weapons. The official death toll from the Gordon Riots was recorded as 285 killed by military action, and another 273 seriously injured, though the actual numbers were certainly higher because many bodies were never recovered from the fires and many wounded died later without being counted. The riots ended on Thursday the 8th of June, when the last significant mob was dispersed by cavalry in Smithfield, and London began the slow process of assessing the damage and restoring order. The burned shell of Newgate stood as a stark reminder of how close the city had come to complete anarchy. The authorities moved quickly to rebuild, not from any concern for the prisoners who would be held there, but from the recognition that a functioning prison was essential to maintaining social order. The architect George Dance the Younger was commissioned to design a new Newgate on the foundations of the old, and he created a structure that was meant to be both more secure and more imposing than what had been destroyed. The new prison was built in the style of a fortress, with massive stone walls, minimal windows, and an entrance that looked like something from a medieval castle designed to intimidate and overawe anyone who approached. Construction began in 1782 and continued for more than a decade, with portions of the prison being opened for use even while work continued on other sections. The new Newgate was larger than the old, with more cells and better separation between different categories of prisoners, but the fundamental nature of the institution remained unchanged. It was still a place of suffering, still operated for profit by keepers who extracted fees from those they held, still overcrowded and disease-ridden and brutal. The riots had destroyed the physical structure, but had not touched the system that the structure housed, and that system simply reconstituted itself in new walls, continuing exactly as before. Prisoners were transferred from temporary holding facilities back into the rebuilt sections of Newgate, and the routines of admission and confinement and punishment resumed without significant alteration. The keeper's position was eventually filled by someone new. The turnkeys were hired and trained, and the ordinary appointed. And within a few years it was as if the fire had never happened, except that the stones were newer and lighter in colour and not yet stained by centuries of misery. The Gordon Riots did produce some reforms, though not the ones that anyone had anticipated. The government increased penalties for rioting and strengthened laws around the use of military force to suppress civil disorder. The Protestant Association was disbanded, its leaders prosecuted, and Lord George Gordon himself was tried for treason, though ultimately acquitted. The Catholic Relief Act remained in effect despite the violence it had provoked, and gradually the paranoia about Catholic influence faded as other political concerns took precedence. But the fundamental questions that the riots had raised about justice and authority and the treatment of prisoners were not addressed. Newgate was rebuilt to be more secure, not more humane, and the conditions that prisoners endured in the new building were essentially identical to what they had endured in the old. The fire had briefly revealed something that most Londoners preferred not to think about, that hundreds of people were confined in cages in the heart of their city, held in conditions that degraded and destroyed them, many awaiting trial for crimes they might not have committed, others awaiting execution for crimes that in a more merciful age might not have warranted death. The riots had forced open those cages and allowed the prisoners to escape, but the escape was temporary and the cages were rebuilt, and the machine of justice continued grinding as it always had, processing the accused and the convicted according to laws that valued property over people and punishment over mercy. The new Newgate rose from the ashes of the old stone by stone, and it would stand for another century, a monument to the conviction that some people deserved to suffer, and that suffering could be organised, rationalised, and profited from without moral consequence. Chapter 10. The Last Door. The 19th century brought change slowly to Newgate. Reforms arriving not through revolution, but through the steady accumulation of small modifications that eventually transformed the institution without quite intending to. The first significant change was the abolition of the keeper's right to charge fees, enacted by Parliament in 1815 after decades of complaints and investigations had finally demonstrated what everyone had known, but few had been willing to address, that the fee system was both unjust and corrupted the entire purpose of imprisonment. The keeper became a salaried official appointed by the city, paid adequately but no longer permitted to extract money from prisoners, and this single reform eliminated many of the worst abuses that had characterised Newgate for centuries. Prisoners were no longer divided between the master's side and the common side based on their ability to pay, though they were still divided by gender and by whether they were awaiting trial or had been convicted. And the quality of accommodation improved marginally for everyone when profit was removed as the primary motivation for their treatment. The physical building continued to evolve as different sections were rebuilt or modified to accommodate changing ideas about how prisoners should be housed. The separate system was introduced in the 1830s, a reform movement that argued criminals could only be rehabilitated through isolation and contemplation of their sins, and portions of Newgate were converted to individual cells where prisoners spent 23 hours each day in solitude, forbidden to speak or communicate with anyone except the chaplain and the wardens. The reformers who advocated for this system believed they were being humane, replacing the chaos and violence of communal cells with the quiet and safety of isolation, but they had not anticipated or did not care that prolonged solitary confinement produced its own form of suffering, driving some prisoners to madness or suicide within weeks. The separate system was eventually modified after reports of mental breakdowns became too frequent to ignore, and prisoners were allowed limited social interaction during exercise periods and chapel services. But the basic principle of separation remained influential in prison design for decades. The most dramatic change came in 1868, when Parliament abolished public execution, ending a tradition that had existed for as long as hanging had been used as punishment. The decision was driven partly by concerns about public order, as execution day crowds had grown increasingly unruly and occasionally erupted into riots, and partly by a growing sense among reformers that turning death into entertainment was barbaric, and degrading to both the condemned and the spectators. The last public execution at Newgate took place on the 26th of May 1868 when a man named Michael Barrett was hanged for his role in a bombing in Clerkenwell, and an estimated 2,000 people gathered outside the prison to witness it despite heavy rain. Barrett died quickly, the newer method of long drop hanging having been adopted to ensure that the neck broke immediately rather than death occurring slowly by strangulation. And the crowd that watched was noticeably more subdued than the execution crowds of earlier decades, as if they understood they were witnessing the end of an era. After 1868, executions were conducted inside Newgate in a specially built shed in the prison yard, and only official witnesses were permitted to attend: the sheriffs, the prison governor, the chaplain, the surgeon, and a few reporters who would write brief factual accounts for the newspapers. The condemned prisoners no longer made the 3-mile journey from Newgate to Tyburn, no longer addressed crowds from carts, no longer died as public spectacle. They walked from their cells to the execution shed on the morning of their death, usually so quickly that they barely had time to understand what was happening before the trapdoor opened beneath them and they dropped through the sudden rupture of falling. The bodies were left hanging for an hour as the law still required, then cut down and buried in unmarked graves within the prison walls, covered with quicklime to speed decomposition. A black flag was raised above the prison to signal that an execution had taken place, and a notice was posted at the gate listing the name of the deceased and confirming that the sentence had been carried out. But these formalities attracted little attention, and the executions became administrative procedures rather than public events. The number of offences punishable by death had been declining throughout the century, as reformers successfully argued that hanging should be reserved for only the most serious crimes. In 1800, English law prescribed death for more than 200 offences, including relatively minor thefts and property crimes. But by 1861, that number had been reduced to just 4: murder, high treason, piracy with violence, and arson in royal dockyards. Most of the executions at Newgate in the late 19th century were for murder, and even then many death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment by the Home Secretary after appeals from defence attorneys or public campaigns for mercy. The machine of death that had once processed dozens of condemned prisoners every month now operated only occasionally, and when it did operate, it did so quietly, out of sight, drained of the theatrical power that public executions had once wielded. The prison population changed as transportation to Australia declined and eventually ended in 1868, meaning that prisoners who once would have been shipped overseas were now kept in English prisons serving longer sentences. Newgate was increasingly used for prisoners awaiting trial rather than serving sentences, as new prisons built specifically for long-term confinement opened around the country and drew off the convicted population. The remand prisoners held at Newgate might spend weeks or months waiting for their cases to be heard, living in conditions that were marginally better than in previous centuries but still grim. Cells that were cold and damp in winter, stifling in summer, barely large enough to accommodate the iron bedstead and bucket that constituted their furnishings. They were allowed exercise in the yard for an hour each day, weather permitting, walking in circles under the watch of wardens who no longer carried clubs but who maintained order through the threat of punishment cells and restricted privileges. The role of the chaplain evolved as well, shifting from commercial exploitation to something more recognisably pastoral, though the position remained complicated by its dual function of providing spiritual counsel and serving institutional needs. The chaplain conducted daily services in the prison chapel, visited prisoners in their cells and tried to prepare the condemned for death, but he no longer published the Ordinary's account or profited from prisoners' final words. The last Ordinary's account had been published in 1814, the practice having gradually fallen out of favour as literacy increased and readers developed more sophisticated tastes in crime literature. The prisoners' stories were still told, but now by professional journalists and novelists who used Newgate as setting and inspiration for works of fiction that were often more compelling than the old formulaic accounts had been. Charles Dickens visited Newgate multiple times and used it in several novels including Oliver Twist, his descriptions of the condemned cells and execution procedures informed by actual observation and interviews with prison officials. Public opinion about Newgate shifted during the Victorian era from general acceptance of its necessity to growing discomfort with what it represented. The prison had stood for so long and had been the site of so much suffering that it seemed haunted by its own history. The stones themselves, appearing to remember the thousands, had passed through its gates and the hundreds who had died within its walls or on the gallows it fed. Reformers argued that such an antiquated institution had no place in a modern city, that its association with brutality and death made it unsuitable for use in an age that prided itself on civilization and progress. The prison's location in the heart of London, which had once made it convenient for courts and officials, was now seen as a problem. The building occupying valuable land that could be used for commercial development and creating a dark presence in a neighbourhood that was trying to modernise. The decision to close Newgate was made in 1807 as part of a broader reorganisation of London's prison system, though the actual closure took several years to implement as prisoners and functions were transferred to other facilities. The last prisoners were removed from Newgate in 1880 and the building stood empty for 2 years, while officials debated what to do with it. Some suggested converting it to another use, a warehouse, a hospital, even a museum of crime and punishment. But these proposals were rejected on various grounds. In 1882, demolition began, and over the course of several months the prison was systematically taken apart, the stones hauled away for reuse in other buildings, the iron bars and gates sold for scrap, the wood burned. Crowds gathered to watch the demolition, just as crowds had once gathered to watch executions, drawn by the spectacle of the famous prison being reduced to rubble, and vendors sold souvenirs, pieces of stone allegedly from the cells, sections of iron allegedly from the condemned hold, photographs of the demolition in progress. The Central Criminal Court, commonly known as the Old Bailey, was built on the site of Newgate using some of the stones from the demolished prison. The court opened in 1807, a grand building in the Edwardian Baroque style, with a copper dome topped by a golden statue of Justice holding scales and a sword. The symbolism was presumably intentional, justice rising from the ruins of punishment, law replacing imprisonment, though the continuity was perhaps more telling than the contrast. The Old Bailey would try criminal cases that once would have been tried at the Sessions House next to Newgate, and defendants convicted at the Old Bailey would be sent to other prisons, but the fundamental machinery of arrest and trial and punishment and confinement remained unchanged. Only the location had moved. The section of Newgate Street where the prison gate had stood was widened and paved and lined with new buildings, and within a generation there was little physical evidence that Newgate had ever existed. A small section of the prison wall was preserved and incorporated into the foundation of a nearby building, and a plaque was eventually installed marking the approximate location of the gate. But these were token gestures toward a history that the city seemed eager to forget. The name Newgate persisted in memory and language, used metaphorically to refer to any grim prison or to the experience of incarceration generally. But fewer and fewer people knew the actual history behind the name, the 7 centuries of suffering that the word encompassed. The prisoners who had been held at Newgate left almost no individual traces in the historical record beyond their entries in the Newgate calendar and the court records that documented their trials. A few became famous enough that their stories survived: Jack Sheppard, the escape artist, Jonathan Wild, the thief-taker, Daniel Defoe, who was imprisoned for seditious libel, and later wrote about his experience. But most were forgotten completely, their names recorded in ledgers that were eventually lost or destroyed, their lives reduced to statistical entries in reports about crime rates and prison populations. They had lived and suffered and died in Newgate, thousands upon thousands of them, and their suffering had served purposes that their society deemed important: deterring crime, punishing wrongdoing, maintaining order, protecting property. Whether those purposes were actually served or whether Newgate simply created more suffering than it prevented was a question that few asked and fewer answered honestly. The architectural historian who stands today at the corner of Newgate Street and Old Bailey Street, looking at the imposing facade of the Central Criminal Court with its golden justice statue gleaming in the sun, would need considerable imagination to picture what once occupied this ground. The massive stone walls with their few narrow windows, the iron gate that stood open during the day to admit prisoners and visitors, and closed at night to seal them in, the courtyard where coffins were stacked on execution mornings, the warren of cells and corridors that descended into darkness beneath the street level. All of that has been erased, buried under newer construction and covered by the accumulated layers of later history, and perhaps that erasure is mercy of a kind, allowing the dead to rest without the constant reminder of their suffering. But the erasure is also forgetting, and forgetting has consequences when the systems that created Newgate's suffering continue to operate in modified forms, when prisons still confine and justice still punishes, and society still believes that some people deserve to be locked away in cages. The last door of Newgate closed in 1880 when the final prisoner was transferred out and the building was sealed pending demolition. That door no longer exists, having been removed and either destroyed or sold, but in a larger sense the door never closed, because the logic that built Newgate continues to build prisons today, the belief that confinement is justice and that suffering is correction. The stones of Newgate were scattered, some used in the Old Bailey, some in other buildings around London, some ground to rubble and used as fill, but the ideas that Newgate embodied were not scattered or ground down but merely relocated, rebuilt in other places, other prisons, other systems of control. The history of Newgate is the history of how societies manage those they fear or despise or simply find inconvenient. And that history did not end when the prison was demolished, but continues in every locked door and every barred window and every human being sitting in a cell tonight waiting for trial or sentence or simply for time to pass in darkness.